Ladies and gentlemen, today is January 14th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Oh, hello.
Yo.
How are you?
Good evening, sir. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Can't complain.
Your year is off to a reasonable start?
Honestly, they all kind of have been blending together the past probably 5-6 years.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Same old, same old.
The beginning of the year doesn't really feel any different than any other time for me these days.
Yeah, well, we do kind of arbitrarily assign the beginning of the year.
True.
January 1st doesn't really mean too much to aliens.
Exactly.
It's a break point in our calendar for some reason.
Yeah.
But chat was very hyped to see you. I did get regular questions about you. We haven't done a session in a bit. Don't know if you had the stream unmuted, but I visited my family for a week. I had a subathon before that, and then I moved. So a lot of stuff going on for me.
Yeah, what's LA like?
It's very nice climate pretty much all year. We're in the dead of winter, and it has a low of like 50 and a high of 62, so extremely mild. To call it winter is a little bit of a stretch. Trisha was explaining to me today that people in LA, they're wearing hoodies right now, not because they need to, but because it's the only time that they can make the excuse to wear that clothing. They're like, I want to show off my winter stuff. Okay, that's fair.
I'm impressed.
Yeah.
You know what the temperature is in Dallas right now?
I heard it was pretty cold.
14 degrees.
14, wow.
Yeah, there's a big freeze that came through recently.
Yeah, you had the super cold winter. Was it last year or the year before?
Oh, the big one was like 21, I think.
Yeah, so 2 to 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's the one that caused all the drama.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one's not as bad as that. The power grid is holding up, last I checked anyway. So it should be fine.
Did they winterize the grid yet?
I have no idea.
We'll find out.
Yeah, we'll figure out the hard way when it happens again, most likely. We'll see.
We're talking Fahrenheit chat.
Yeah,
14 Fahrenheit.
Yeah, it'll depend on what they do with the natural gas lines, because that was actually the bigger problem at the time. Mm-hmm. More so than the actual equipment, the power generation equipment itself. What would you call them? The wind turbines. Some of the state officials tried to lay the blame on renewable energy and whatnot too. In addition to the winterization critique. So yeah, not as big a deal as the fact that just the natural gas lines froze. They weren't ready for that, and most of the power generated here in Texas comes from natural gas. So whether or not the natural gas companies have prepared, I don't know. That's going to be the big question.
Have people in Texas considered, instead of winterizing the equipment, taking more of a Ted Cruz approach and just taking a Cancun vacation whenever it gets really cold?
The people who can afford to go to Cancun were not the people who were hurting.
Oh, I see.
So they weren't really thinking of that. They were doing okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, the people who froze on the street probably are the ones who had the bigger issue. But most of them don't vote, so not a big deal for the government.
Right. So it goes. Well, I hope you can deal with this winter reasonably enough. I remember when you did have that, like, a really, really cold storm or whatever you want to call it. You never lost power, so you were in a nice sweet spot, but a lot of other people did. Yeah,
I was lucky. I was quite lucky. But unfortunately, not everybody was.
Mm-hmm. So I've been doing some Balers Gate honor mode runs. I just wiped freshly today at level 4 against the Spider Matriarch.
Ooh, yeah, that can be a tough one.
Yeah, that's a tough boss. I've also died to the Hag. Chat was telling me you're supposed to be level 5 before you fight her, and I tried fighting her at level 4. And then I've wiped to the Gnolls. There's like a elite Gnoll in that pack fighting the two guys in the cave.
Yeah,
I wiped there once, and then I fought the harpies one time, and they lured all 4 of my party, and I just watched them all get torn to shreds. So
Yeah, that harpy one, it can be especially tricky if you're not leveled up.
Yep.
Yeah, it's really early game, so you're not really expecting such a steep jump in the learning curve, but there it is.
Yep. It's a really fun mode. I've been enjoying it a lot, and it feels a lot more intense for chat as well, because every battle you could potentially lose if you mess up.
Yeah.
Like for the Spider Matriarch fight today, I would say I went into the fight with good preparation of my party was reasonably well-rounded. I had all my spells, I had all my resources, I had consumes, but I got too spread out because it's a really big open area and the spiders can teleport around, but you can't.
Yeah.
In the same way, so my main character, who is a rogue, got separated from the rest of the party and killed, and my healer couldn't get over to them because the webs had everyone stuck. So, yep, we live and die with our mistakes.
So it goes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's
Have you been playing that still?
I kind of got away from it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up back in Stellaris a bit, and then Elite Dangerous. I don't know if you've heard of that.
I've heard of it, but I haven't played it.
Yeah, I picked that up for the first time since like 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of played it for a couple weeks to kind of try it out and liked it. Said I'd get back to it, and 6 years later, finally got around to it. So that's been fun too.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Baldur's Gate, I haven't been playing as much.
Yeah, I took a month off Baldur's Gate, and then when they introduced the honor mode, that got me back into it. I haven't really gone back to normal play aside from that because it just seems so tasty if I could get a honor mode clear.
Yeah.
Feels like a pretty hardcore gamer thing to do. There are a lot of very, very optimized guides for how to multi-class everything to get the maximum damage output and stuff like that, which I haven't researched too much. I'm trying to kind of intuit my way there myself with a little bit of chat's help. Thank you, chat. That's been a good time. And then I actually did get a chance to go through the first 7 chapters of American Nations, the book you recommended to me.
Yeah, what did you think of that?
It's super good. Basically, all of the information was new to me, which is really refreshing because we're American and we did get some education about the origins of the US, but fucking none of this shit was in there because it really casts a realistic light on what happened, and it doesn't sugarcoat stuff or make it into a fairy tale. One example is the story of Pocahontas. Does anyone know of that one? Turns out the Disney movie was not the most accurate portrayal of what went down. It was very far from it.
Yeah.
The cool thing about this book is it breaks down the different colonization angles into the New World between the French, the English, and the Spanish, at least so far, that I've gone through, and the different places they landed, and also their game plan with how they intended to make use of the land and also how they were going to approach the natives in the area. They had lots of different solutions to that or ideals for how people should be treated and so on. And it was interesting because all of their approaches had upsides and downsides. Like no one really took a perfect angle at it. It kind of depends on what you value in setting up. But you've got just for the really short version, the Spanish arrived first and they kind of went in through Mexico and then through Texas and toward California and kind of got that region. And they were very heavily Catholic at the time, aggressively so. And then you've got the British who hit the east coast of the US from a variety of angles, from the deep south to New England and up in the north there. And then the French, it talks mainly about them setting up in Canada, and it talks about all their different approaches to how the land should be governed, what resources they're trying to extract, how they treat their people, and also what kind of people they send over to those spots. Oh, and then the other one that I forgot, which is the Dutch. The Dutch setting up New Amsterdam, which later became called New York. Super, super interesting stuff. Very fucked up. A lot of the things that people did. Jamestown, actually, the place where John Smith or whatever was for the Pocahontas story,
Yeah.
That was basically where you just send criminals and adventurers and ruffians to just go fuck shit up and try to make money. That was basically their angle. And then the Spanish, it was like, how much gold and Catholicism can we gain from this situation? And then for the French, it was sort of like they wanted to make France happen over there as well, with a lot of the ideals of including the natives and treating them as equals, but also maintaining a lot of the feudal society kind of principles of there should be lords and there should be peasants, and they kind of kept those classes very separate from each other. So the French actually bled a lot of their people who they wanted to use as serfs, who were like, no, I would rather just be a woodsman and live how the natives do, because then at least I'm an equal to the rest of them. So you've got that, and then you've also got the Puritans, who went on the East Coast, and they were really trying to build the ideal society. And the main downside for them was they were super prudes, where you did anything that it was even considered slightly lewd or whatever, and you're going to be heavily punished. It even talks about a story of a husband who had traveled for 3 years and returned home, and he kissed his wife on the porch, and they ended up putting him in the stocks because the manner of their kissing was far too lewd for their wholesome village.
Yeah.
It's like, man, where's the empathy? He missed his wife. Come on.
No, they're not having it.
Oh, and the Pocahontas story, it's so funny because John Smith, he basically goes back after getting captured by the chief, and he makes it seem like he persuaded them because Pocahontas just said, don't kill him. We need to keep him alive or whatever because I love him or something. He made it about himself, when really the Native American society in that region would be, if you capture another dude's territory, you don't kill him. You ritually adopt him, where you are now his dad. And that's what this chief was trying to do, being like, okay, well, I defeated John Smith and his troops and stuff, so I'm going to go through this ritual and say that I'm now his dad, and he can go back home. And he totally misunderstood that and thought that he was just that high charisma that he survived that check.
Yeah.
And also Pocahontas died a couple years after getting to England because of disease, so not really as good of a story as you might have hoped.
No. Get sick and died. That's not like a dramatic conclusion to a good story, really.
No. Yeah, very good book. Doesn't sugarcoat anything. We'll see how it shapes up for the later stages. It's kind of going chronologically of who arrived there first. And it's very funny, too, that this whole sequence of colonies established was based on a huge navigation error of trying to find a way to India and thinking that you actually got there when really you're in the Western Hemisphere, not in India at all. That's why the Native Americans are called Indians by some people.
Yeah, accident of history. Yeah, I really appreciated the history with regard to events that took place in the 1600s, because that's not really a historical era that is taught much in U.S. history here. We don't get a lot of that. So I found it very fascinating.
Yeah, same.
That particular era. Have you gotten to the stuff about the Scots-Irish yet?
Not yet.
Okay. That's going to be especially fun.
I just finished the chapter on the Deep South, which I didn't know this, but a lot of their model for how society was structured and how plantations worked was based on the colonies in Barbados, which were islands that had a bunch of sugar cane, so it's very valuable. And their whole approach was very Zerg-like in the sense of, we're just going to throw bodies at the plantations and just get lots of money, and then as people die, they just work them to death and then resupply with new workers. So super unethical, super evil, but because they were so wasteful with human life in that sense, they were able to capitalize on having a whole bunch of sugarcane and resource, which was very valuable at the time because people wanted sugar in their food and their tea and so on. So they got to live very lavish lifestyles, and seeing cities like Charleston that are super colorful and beautiful is sort of the history of people who are so rich as plantain owners that they got to just basically fuck around in town all the time. and do
Yeah.
cool shit
Yeah.
instead of actually working their own land. So
Yeah, I got kind of an oil chic vibe reading about that.
yeah.
Kind of a similar dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Brazil had the same history, at least northeastern Brazil had the same history with plantation slavery,
Mm-hmm.
and especially with regard to having the high mortality rate amongst the slaves, to the point where the number of slaves imported from Africa into northeastern Brazil, if not Brazil generally, was actually surprisingly high relative to the number of people of African descent in Brazil today. Given how many people were imported, you would think the population of people with African descent would be much higher. But the reason it's not is because the mortality rate was just so high that most of those people ended up dying.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a massively unethical endeavor. Just I think it was hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people ended up dying, which is all the more impressive given the era, because they didn't have like gas chambers and stuff. It was all 15th and 16th century technology that they were using just to bring all of those people over. But that's just how high the profits were.
Yeah.
Sugar and some of the other commodities they were making were just so valuable that it made sense to do it like that.
Yeah, and there also was, and this is a thing that wasn't really taught in schools very much in the US anyway, the Africans who are brought over, they're not all the same. Like they're from different tribes and different countries, and they speak different languages and stuff, which in a sense, it made it more difficult for them to organize amongst each other. And it also created a really big barrier in just understanding people, like from the European colonists to understand like, hey, they actually have the same music and food and culture and history and stuff that we do. They just don't speak our same language. A lot of imperialists in general, this isn't specific to Europe, I would guess that Japanese imperialism had a similar thing where you believe that your society is inherently superior and more moral than other societies. So you think that you deserve more stuff than them, and you also deserve to tell them how to live their life. We see this a lot with what the Spaniards were doing. Part of the reason the Spaniards didn't end up dominating the Western Hemisphere entirely was because they were so busy Spanish Inquisitioning people. They needed to make sure people were properly Catholic, and anyone who was doing weird shit was going to be just straight up killed. And it created an interesting, I guess it was like a brain drain from them to the Dutch. So the Dutch ended up getting a whole bunch of insanely good thinkers of the time, like Galileo and Descartes and so on, who were basically fleeing religious persecution, but not because they were religious. They were fleeing from religion.
Mm-hmm.
So very small country, but the Dutch had a ton of technology and a ton of power for that time period. And the Spanish had a lot of resources, and if they were more careful about investing in the future of the Americas, they definitely could have taken a lot more territory. But they really wanted to prioritize their religious mission because the Pope decided that Spain was the bestest and most Catholic country at the time. So they wanted to really spearhead that effort.
Yeah, the queen, well, I guess the king and the queen of Spain in the 1400s, when they decided to, fund Columbus's expedition, both of them were very religious. So it's kind of not surprising that that left an institutional legacy, that later generations of the royal family would follow. Also, they were just very ambitious. The Spanish king, the kingdom, the Spanish government at the time, had, sort of big dreams of exerting Christian power in Europe and maybe possibly even unifying Europe under a Habsburg dynasty. And, all of that stuff was very expensive. Wars with the Ottoman Empire were expensive. Obviously, the 30 Years' War was immensely expensive and immensely destructive. So, a lot of major expenses like that ended up draining the budget. And beyond that, just the general flow of gold from the New World into Spain, in addition to the government's profligacy, created a lot of inflation in the Spanish economy. with the result that a lot of Spanish manufacturing, such as it was at the time, ended up becoming uncompetitive. A lot of even a lot of the manufactured goods that Spain exported to its colonies in the Americas actually ended up coming more from France and the UK, if not also the Netherlands. And that was just because the foreign goods were more competitive, price-wise. And that wasn't supposed to happen. There were some legal avenues, but in general, the way they set up trade with the New World was to heavily benefit producers in Spain. But just because of all the devaluation, all the inflation rather from gold imports and spending, meant that it wasn't feasible. And that had the knock-on effect of undermining the Spanish economy, ironically, and then leading to successive debt crises over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. So, ironically, Spain, getting all of this gold and all of this commerce in the New World ended up somewhat undermining their economy because they didn't have the administrative capacity and expertise in order to manage it properly. Mm-hmm. So, that also played a role, too, in Spain's inability to take advantage of the New World, which I don't think is discussed as much in the book. That was something I kind of read elsewhere. Mm. But also, because of all these wars in the 1600s, one of the things that Spain did in Latin America was to focus a lot more on extracting value rather than expansion, which had not really been the case in the 1500s. In the 1500s, it was heavily, policy was heavily leaned towards expansion. They wanted to get more territory because that meant more resources, more people, more taxes, etc. But in the 1600s, it became apparent that they could save money by cutting costs that had been incurred by focusing on expansion and focusing instead on trying to maximize the value of what resources they already had. And so that shift in policy also played a role in the curtailment of Spanish expansion in the Americas after the late 1500s or so.
Yeah, they definitely were just using it as a resource siphon rather than trying to set up a high-quality base there. It was saying that the resources and the assets of the Spanish missions and stuff was just so poor, and there was basically no oversight because the New World stuff was so far away that it seemed like a pretty major missed opportunity. But if you're thinking about it in a short-term capacity, that is the short-term way to get the most value out of that base, is to just grab everything that's there and bring it back to yourself, because setting up a really nice colony and stuff is a very long-term investment. Like, it's going to be shitty for a good 50 to 100 years before it's anything that you would call a good or nice colony that people would want to go to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the local elites didn't help either, because a lot of the conquistadors and their descendants, who basically became the new nobility in the Spanish conquered territories, they were not that interested in more people coming in after them or in respecting the authority of the Spanish government. I think one of the stories I read was that there was an official sent by the Spanish government to try to get the local elites to pay more taxes, obey more of the Spanish crown's writ. And not only did they refuse to do so, but they actually threatened the guy's life. They said, if you try to make us do this, something's going to happen to you. And the guy ended up having to walk back because, at that time, there's no telephones, there's no internet, right? The guy is, it takes months to get communiques back to Spain. So he's isolated, right? He doesn't have his own power base there. The local elites are the ones who literally just run the countries, run the territories. And he just didn't have the leverage to really actually pursue his job, to actually pursue his objectives as laid out by the Spanish crown when he was dispatched from Spain. And one of the knock-on effects of that is that also expansion was curtailed for that reason, because the local elites weren't as interested in that. They were more interested in protecting their fiefdoms, because that was their livelihood, and they didn't want to pay a bunch of money in taxes or go fight in a bunch of wars for some guy across an ocean that they didn't particularly care for, other than superficially. They did in so much as they had to, but beyond that, they really considered themselves masters of the New World. And that did not really help matters. So uh, it was a hugely impressive conquest in the sense that Spain, a relatively small country, was able to conquer an amount of territory equivalent to a continent. But the trouble that they had, when you get right down to it, beyond all the other factors that we've discussed, is that it was just too large a stretch of territory for a country of that size and income to realistically be able to seriously administer.
Yeah.
Even in the 1600s, when they were focusing on extracting value from the territory, even then, most of that effort was on very specific stretches of territory they controlled. Like, they were never able to exploit all of it over the course of the 1600s and 1700s. There were big stretches of it that they didn't really govern at all. The only parts that they really were able to govern directly were the parts that they directly had significant numbers of troops and where there were significant built-up urban areas. Mexico City and the road to Veracruz, right, the port on the east coast, and then the road to some of the more important mines in the north of Mexico. Like, for a long time, that stretch of area right there, just those three destinations and the roads between them were effectively the Spanish presence in the territory. That effectively was Spanish America in Mexico. And you could describe a similar situation in places like Peru, if not also Central America. Maybe Cuba's the exception because they actually had pretty thoroughly settled that. But in the other territories, they were just so big that they didn't have the capacity to administer anything more than a few areas at a time. And so most of the exploitation that happened in the 1600s was just a handful of specific mines, basically, and then a handful of urban areas, and that was it. So if that's the best they could do, then it's no surprise that they just didn't have the resources to really do significantly more.
Yeah, it makes sense. If you're looking at it like an RTS map, the Americas are super duper far away from Europe. So your ability to oh no, that village is under attack, ain't no way you can go realistically defend it. And that was one of the big advantages of the colonies, which later become the United States, in taking their territory is, yeah, you can send boats over, but geez Louise, does it take months to do so. So the response time is incredibly slow. It seems like the notion of taking the closest, highest value locations first and then really getting the most value of defending those and extracting the value from those would make the most sense. So a location like California, while it's very fertile and good land and amazing terrain and so on, it's just so goddamn far. They were talking about getting anything to one of the Spanish colonies that was in the New Mexico / Texas region or California. You would have to take a boat from Spain, go to Mexico, like in the Gulf of Mexico, and then go over land from the coast in Mexico all the way there. That terrain is really difficult. It's not going to be roads that you're going over. So getting anything to that location, geez Louise. Very far moved.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, the logistics were crazy, especially for that. I mean, even now, right? The logistics are impressive, but especially so for that era when they just had, much slower, less developed technology. It's wild they were able to make it happen at all. If the native population had not been decimated, it probably would not have happened at all. But as was, it was a mega catastrophe for the native population in that regard.
Yeah, the wild card for the whole exchange was probably the disease meta that the Europeans brought over. Like, you didn't even have to fight them per se. You just had to exist in a very densely populated continent that had many cities that culled many people over time by smallpox and syphilis and all manner of other things, and then just shake hands with them. And then it's just going to be ouch for that whole population, even if you have good intentions. That was something that I feel like no one could have really anticipated, because I think they had the germ theory of disease at that point, but it was a very low level, and a lot of people would not be educated about that. But aside from that, it was interesting reading in the book that Tenochtitlan forgive my pronunciation, the capital of Mexico, and the Aztecs at the time was maybe one of the most advanced cities in the world at that point. But
Yeah.
it gets kind of a bad rap because it did fall pretty quickly. The gun technology and stuff was a major factor there. And then it didn't mention this in the book. I don't know if you have information about this, but I think I read in Guns, Germs, and Steel that there were also a bunch of prophecies about people arriving within the Aztec tradition. So in some way, they kind of got more leniency than they might have otherwise, just based on their own religion and prophecies of people arriving at the land. Because if they're super skeptical of these people who landed, they can just like attack them on sight.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that they could have done, but it seemed like they were a little bit more curious and observant than they necessarily needed to be.
Well, the bigger problem for the Aztecs is that they were assholes. They had a decentralized empire based on tribute. So, the capital region, the Aztecs started in that area around Tenochtitlan, and they pushed out beyond, and they forced the surrounding territories to become tributaries. And they did that, further and further afield until they had, an empire. But the trouble with the tributary system is that, your tributaries never really like you very much. You're basically just some foreigner who's forcing them to give stuff up. And the Aztecs also forced them to give up people for sacrifice, which, was kind of part of the culture at the time, but probably was not popular, especially amongst the tributaries.
Yeah.
So when the Spanish came, you're right, there was a religious element. There were prophecies about, the gods coming pretty much the same year that the Spanish came. And so that definitely created a little more room to maneuver for the Spanish. But the bigger factor was that the Spanish were able to divide and conquer. The tributaries were quite happy to find somebody who was willing to fight the Aztecs, and seemingly were able to succeed against them. So the fact that they were able to beat the Aztecs on the field was probably one of, if not the most important factors to the Spanish conquest. Because it really was not just like an army of white people, just beating up on natives. Because if that's all it would have been, they would have failed, because they didn't have nearly enough people. I mean, the Spanish expedition, led by Cortez, that conquered the Aztec Empire, never had more than a few thousand people in it. Not even really that. It was very small. In order to actually successfully take on the Aztecs, they needed a lot of the tributaries to, one, not send troops to fight with the Aztecs, and two, not only not fight with the Aztecs, but to fight against them, to join the Spanish. And that's effectively what happened. By the time the war against the Aztecs ended, the Spanish had a huge army. I want to say it was like 50 to 100,000 people, the vast majority of which were just natives who had come from other tributary states to fight with the Spanish.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was a big team effort. But the history doesn't really focus as much on that. They tend to focus more on the great man history, right? It was Cortez being amazing that made it happen. And there's some truth to that. It is genuinely impressive that he was able to build a coalition like that and make it stick. But we just don't know nearly as much about the native leaders in the tributary states who contributed to the war effort, because the history just hasn't paid much attention to them. To be fair, there's probably not as much literature, primary source literature, that is to say, about them. So, there's not a lot to work with in that regard. But they were definitely important factors.
Yeah, so he rolled high situationally. He had a lot of factors in his favor, but then also capitalized on those.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, one of the guys that fought with Cortez in the expedition actually wrote a book about it, his experience. And it was called The Discovery and Conquest of Mexico. I forget what the guy's name is, but I actually did read the book, and it was surprisingly fascinating. Books kind of written hundreds of years ago can be a little dry sometimes. But this was not. This was really engaging. He really wrote from a first-person perspective. And if I remember correctly, it was one of the first such books written, sort of a historical memoir of a major event. It was one of the first such novels to be written and to be widely successful in Europe. So historically relevant on a number of levels in that regard. But anybody interested in the topic, I would strongly recommend reading that book. It's very easy to read, and it's very easy to get engrossed in it. It's a real page turner, somewhat surprisingly.
I have a Protoss attacking me right now, but can you write down the name of that book in Discord so I can look it up later?
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Let's see. Wait, where are you? Neuro, there you are.
Thank you. The book that we're discussing, chat, is called American Nations. And it's about all the different nations of people that made their way to the Americas and their interactions with the natives and that kind of thing. Pretty cool. It goes into a lot more depth than I learned in school in the US, even in like college level classes. In college level classes, you usually break down some of the propaganda. Like in elementary, middle, and high school, there is a lot of like, this is how the US fought for their freedom. Weren't we so brave? Yeah, wow, that was so brave. And Thanksgiving was when the Pilgrims and the natives had food together. And it's like, wow, what a wholesome story. Isn't America the best? That's what we're taught. And then you get to college and you're like, yeah, actually, a lot of people were just kind of assholes and they just fucked people up and took what they wanted. And it's like, oh, I thought we were the good guys. It's like situationally, we have been on the good guy side sometimes. But you can't put all the people who went over to the Americas in the good guy category. You're going to have a bad time.
Yeah. So it goes. Did you read the chapter on the Yankees yet?
Yes. Yankeedom,
yeah. Yeah, I found it interesting. He's going to write more about it later in the book. You'll get to it. But I did find it interesting just how many American institutions were pioneered by the Yankees, the Northeasterners. Mm-hmm. That was one of the fun things I kind of learned from the book.
Yeah, they were definitely the most experimental in terms of trying new shit and trying specifically to build a new and ideal society. They did take some ideas from like the Greeks and stuff of like having representatives and councils and that kind of thing, but it was more about we are all citizens and we should just have meetings to figure stuff out. And everyone who lives here has a stake in this. So it was saying that town hall meetings are a big thing in the Northeast for that reason, and they still are, even to this day, just because of that initial mission and purpose of their people to have fair representation, not to have lords and serfs, but just like one community that tries to build stuff. And I think another one of the factors for this group was they were also extremely educated people. It wasn't like rich nobles, it was like the nerdy people, the engineers, the lawyers, the people who know how to write shit, who were maybe not super rich, but they were super smart and they had a skill set. So when they went over to the New World, they were kind of self-sufficient of they could all figure out what to do. One of the reasons why Tidewater, which is the kind of middle of the US, failed so hard was it was just a bunch of fucking bandits. It was basically just the bandit run of send anyone who is very adventurous and ambitious and doesn't have much to lose in that direction. Mm-hmm. And these were fighting people. They definitely fucked some shit up, but it wasn't as structured or as clear in terms of their objectives in what kind of society you're trying to build. Actually, I don't care. I'm just an adventurer and I want gold. Okay.
Yeah. It was not the most high-minded region of the United States in that regard. Yeah, literacy was super important. As I've studied history, one of the recurring themes I've noted is that those peoples, castes, religious groups, or ethnic groups that prized literacy the most, often for religious reasons, ended up being the ones that were the most successful later during industrialization and then even in subsequent eras, because literacy gave your people a big edge in terms of their ability to learn new technologies, new skills, learn the law, learn professions, and then take advantage of those opportunities. Mm-hmm. So literacy was a huge edge for Yankees in the Northeast. And it's one of the reasons that industrialization in the United States really started there in their region and not in the others.
It was the nerd area. Let's go.
Yeah, from what I remember, I don't know if this was in the book or not, but from what I remember reading, there was a lot of wealthy elites in the South that really wanted, like quite purposely, to try to recreate sort of the feudal system of lords from Europe in the United States. That was sort of their vision. They thought of themselves as being superior, and they wanted to be a part of that superior landed elite class, which they saw as superior in Europe. So, ironically, they didn't come here to try to create something different. They were literally just trying to recreate what already existed in Europe at the time. So, no surprising that between that vision and the northern vision of a more egalitarian democratic society, it was really the northern vision that ended up becoming the bedrock of the American identity.
Yeah. Yeah, well, if you are a lord or a lady and that system is heavily benefiting you, it makes sense that you would want to have more of that system.
Yeah. It stands to reason.
Yeah.
But that interesting divide has kind of persisted in the political cultures of the regions. You can kind of see that more egalitarian streak in the Northeast and then the slightly more authoritarian streak in the South. Which is not to say that the North did not have its own authoritarian streak, but it manifested a little differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
I
sure
found the Dutch setting things up as basically the actual diverse community, and that one still basically carries over today in the sense that New York is very multifaceted. Also, the fact that New York has a very large Jewish community, that's kind of just by survival, because Jewish people have existed, and in a lot of time periods they weren't allowed to exist there because the population of the time was suspicious of them. So yeah, it's kind of cool that New York also ended up being a really nice multicultural and intellectual hub, because a lot of the smart people who weren't following the religious code perfectly, they weren't allowed other places, so that's the place that they would go.
Yeah, the Netherlands really punched above its weight back in the day.
And for a really small country, they had a ridiculous economy and tech level.
Oh yeah, like I think their urbanization was near 50% or so in the 1600s, which is crazy high for that era. And they had all of this cool tech and stuff, windmills, which are, it sounds mundane now, but like at the time, just the extent of the use of windmills and what they were used for, draining the land, creating new land, that was, innovative, like genuinely so. And even more interesting is the system of capital that they had, that they used to fund all of it. Because Amsterdam had, I believe, the first stock market in the history of Europe. And it was set up around that time, in the very early 1600s. So that allowed the Dutch not only to access funds to invest in industry that came from the savings of their own people, but from the savings of other people in Europe. Amsterdam became sort of the place to go if you wanted to invest in something, whatever, be it government bonds or private equity. Amsterdam was kind of where you did that. And so that allowed the Dutch to have a lot more money to use, not only to invest in their own infrastructure, but to invest in their navy, to invest in their military during emergencies, et cetera, which again just allowed them to do a lot more than you would expect a country of that modest size. So yeah, very cool country. Didn't last. It kind of dropped the ball in the 1700s.
What was the reason for that?
They just kind of got complacent. The Dutch Empire kind of started to survive off of rents rather than innovation. Over the course of the 1600s, they were able to corner the market on spices. They actually beat the English in that regard. They were both trying to figure out where the spices in the Far Eastern spice trade were originating from. Because, nobody would tell them. Nobody wanted to tell them where they were getting the spices. because they knew that would mean more competition. So they had to figure out where the islands were pretty much on their own, and there was a race to figure it out because they knew whoever was first would end up dominating the islands and then cornering the trade. And so the Dutch actually beat the English and won out. And so it seemed as though the Dutch would be the paramount trading power in the Far East after that. But the trouble was that after cornering the market, eventually prices got so high because they were using their monopoly power to push them up, that there was a big incentive for other producers to start up. Especially the English noted that if they could start producing spices in territory they did control, they would be able to eat into the Dutch market share and get some of those profits. And there was more and more incentive to do that the higher the prices got. And eventually that's exactly what they did. They actually stole seeds and smuggled them out of the Spice Islands, among other territories. And they started growing those spices in mostly India, but also other places. And that kind of marked the decline of the spice trade. And there was also a lot of corruption in the Dutch East India Company. They were supposed to focus on maximizing profit and returning funds to investors, but in reality, a lot of people working for the company kind of stole money from the company or engaged in trading on the side that they were not technically allowed to do. So that all ate into the company's market share and just undermined overall profits. So just over time, the Dutch East India Company declined on its own, just as an institution, managerially, and just the underlying economics of the company as well were slowly hollowed out as the spice trade hollowed out and declined. And, Dutch capital markets kind of responded to that by focusing, well, partly they focused on that, partly they were responding to that, but partly they were also responding to greater competition in Europe, because before, Dutch shipping had dominated the grain trade in the Baltic, which does not sound sexy at all. You're just moving around grain in the Baltic. How important could it be? It was actually more important than the Far Eastern trade to the Netherlands, because there was actually a lot more money in the Baltic grain trade than in the Far Eastern trade. The Far Eastern trade generated very high profits, but overall, the trade in aggregate was not as big as the Baltic grain trade. And what happened over time is that foreign ships, especially English ships, started eating up market share. They started dominating the carry trade. And as the Dutch lost that, their economic competitiveness and their broader economy started to decline as well. And Dutch industry also started to decline in the 1700s because of international competition. Other people started producing manufactured goods that were just as competitive, if not better. And so as that happened, Dutch manufacturers kind of had to do what actually a lot of modern manufacturers in first world countries have had to do over the past century, which is that, as there's low-cost producers in other countries competing for the lower end of the market, you, as the first mover, start focusing on the premium end of the market because generally your brand is stronger, people trust you more, and you generally know the technology better and can kind of innovate and produce highly valuable, very expensive stuff that is a very high quality, to a degree that your other competitors focusing on the low end of the market cannot do. So that's what the Dutch did. Their overall exports started to decline, and the composition of their exports started to focus very narrowly on the highest end of the market, of the various markets that they were producing for. So the decline of Dutch manufacturing, the decline of the Baltic grain trade, the decline of the Dutch East India Company, all meant that the stock exchange in Amsterdam had less and less stuff that was Dutch to invest in. And the result is that they shifted almost their entire exchange to focusing on sovereign debt, which is to say, government debt, government borrowing, not just Dutch, but just, European governments in general. Whenever they wanted to borrow money, generally they would go to Amsterdam to do it. That was like the center for sovereign debt trading. And that just became the sine qua non of the country pretty much from that point on. As the financial trade, sovereign debt trading in Amsterdam became the Dutch economy for the most part. They were still very good at agriculture, very productive, but it wasn't enough to kind of carry the economy and maintain it as a major economic power in Europe. So all of that happened roughly over the course of the 1600s and 1700s, and the result is that by 1800, the Dutch had significantly declined as a major player in Europe.
So is it still a financial center today?
Yeah, Amsterdam remained the center for sovereign debt trading in Europe through, I think, much of the 19th century. And I think it only shifted then I think it was only then, in like the mid 19th century, that it finally shifted over to London. And Amsterdam kind of retained its importance as a financial center of Europe, but after the mid 19th century, it was never again like the main financial center like it had been.
That makes sense. I'm thinking of it now in terms of their moral liberalism, progressivism, in the sense that they weren't as much of a religious hard-ass country back in the day. So for them to have more open sex work and also weed. So for a tourist destination, it's kind of like a Vegas in the sense of they haven't really been as prudish about stuff like that. If you want to, have a little bit of the hashish or get a little bit nasty, that's okay. But then for countries that have more strict religious sensibilities, like people who come from the Puritan United States lineage, it seems like a very naughty country.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even back in the day, 1600s and whatnot, that was the general impression of the Dutch. That was one of the reasons the Puritans didn't stay. I don't remember if this was in the book or not, but the Puritans, there was a big wave of Puritans that left England, and they didn't go to America first. They actually went to Amsterdam first. That was the first place they went, because they thought of themselves as religious dissidents. But of course, they were very, very conservative. Amsterdam was not. So they were not a good fit. They did not like it. They did not get along with the locals. And so it was only after that experiment failed that they ended up thinking, well, fuck it, let's just cross an ocean and get as far away from these people as we can get.
That makes sense. Well, good on you, Dutch, for the stuff that you did well. Also, Dutch people are very tall.
That's true.
That's another random thing.
Yeah, I mean, just the advanced urbanization in the Netherlands, I think, is responsible for a lot of what you mentioned. Just the general popularity and persistence of liberalism. Generally, liberalism is more popular in urban areas. And so no surprise then that the most urban society in Europe over the course of much of the early modern period of its history would be a center then of liberalism.
It's also still a major hub of StarCraft 2. A lot of the most famous StarCraft people who are still active in the scene are Dutch. I think, chat, correct me if I'm wrong, Loco, Harstem, and Rotterdam are all Dutch, right? This is a question for chat. I think that's the case. I'm not trying to offend anyone. Yeah, it's very strong gamer country as well. I think they have some of the best Dota players in the world too.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah. Chat says yes. Okay, thank you.
Wonder why that is.
Why they're so tall?
No, I mean why there's so many gamers, yeah.
It's a high-tech country. I feel like any high-tech country is going to have a good share of gamers. Humans are good at games. They have good internet. If you want to play games with good internet, you could do so in the Netherlands. Also, they're tall people, big hands. You can reach all the keys easily. Who knows?
There you go.
Yeah, it's funny. The three gentlemen that I mentioned are 6 foot, 6'3", and 6'4".
Huh.
Yeah.
Now I have a question for you. I don't know if you've ever thought of this. Have you ever wondered why the Dutch Empire, after it declined over the course of the 1700s, how is it able to survive competition with the British Empire? Would not the British, as the more powerful empire, not have absorbed the Dutch Empire?
Why did they not?
Yeah, so there were kind of two things. One, the British actually kind of did. They actually did absorb certain Dutch territories. South Africa being one such example. What you would call now Sri Lanka was originally Dutch. The British ended up absorbing that. But most of the Dutch Empire actually was retained by the Dutch. And the reason they were able to pull that off is because relations between the Netherlands and the British were actually pretty good over most of their history. Back in like the 1500s, 1600s, there was sort of the common religion, specifically the Protestant religion that they both shared, that created a lot of sympathy. Didn't always manifest in state policy in the UK, because I guess it would have been England at that time. England at that time had a Catholic royal family for the most part. but the majority of the population was Protestant. So there was a lot of shenanigans over the course of the 1600s that stemmed from that fact. It's actually really fascinating history if you ever have time for it. But in general, the English were broadly sympathetic to the Dutch. And so there was not really much of a sense that they wanted to fight them, unless there was money at stake. They did fight over trade a couple of times, and that was somewhat popular in the course of for a couple decades in the late 1600s. But what happened is that there was a guy. Have you ever heard of William of Orange?
Yes.
Yeah,
he's in the book.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I don't remember if they discussed it or not, but over the course of the Glorious Revolution, he became King of England. And that created kind of a de facto unified kingdom. It was never officially a dual kingdom or anything like that, but relations after that were generally pretty good. But that also somewhat undercut Dutch competitiveness, because there was a number of major Dutch traders that took the opportunity to move over to London, and Amsterdam kind of lost a little bit from that, kind of lost a step as a result. But more to the point, because of that détente, as a result of William of Orange becoming King of England, there was not nearly as much competition. And the result is that the Dutch Empire was de facto safeguarded, because there was sort of officially a royal tie between the two countries.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I heard there was a lot of people who were trying to capitalize on that power shift. Basically, anytime someone else is contesting power, all the people who had wanted power at the time were like, this might be my chance. Maybe this guy likes me. In the book, it mentioned that they were hoping that William of Orange was a little bit more going to pursue radical change with his governance, but he wasn't quite as much so. Like, definitely some power shifts and so on, but not really as dramatic as the people who are really kind of radically hoping for change got.
No, he ended up being relatively moderate, which makes sense.
Yeah, if you don't want to rock the boat, so you maintain your power.
Yeah, he was a savvy politician. That was one of his big strengths. So, once he gets into power into another country through somewhat nefarious means, perhaps no shock that he's not interested in kind of pissing everybody off. Doesn't want somebody doing to him what he did to the previous royal family.
Yeah. That makes sense.
But that's how the Dutch Empire was able to survive. The British never even really thought of preying on them after that. There was a brief period during, and this is actually interesting for us Americans, there was a brief period when they were kind of de facto at war. It was never declared, but during the American Revolutionary War, there had been a change of government in the Netherlands, and the new government was much more hawkish, especially vis-a-vis the British. And the result is that new Dutch government ended up supporting the American colonies in their revolution, which actually created a lot of tension with the British. And eventually, the Dutch were effectively defeated in that regard. Again, not much fighting between them, but the result is that the new government failed to achieve its objectives. And the government that replaced them was Anglophile once again. So over the course of Dutch history after the 1600s, it's almost entirely Anglophile in its foreign relations, except for the American Revolution when they were suddenly very hawkish. So just for us, Neuro, just for us, they turned on the British.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Dutch people. Much appreciated.
We were having a bit of a problem.
I'm glad you're enjoying the book.
Yeah, it's really good. I was going to nap on the plane, but I was like, this is too good. I'm going to keep going. And then I arrived at my destination. I was like, man, I learned some shit. That's the kind of book that feels good to read because it's exciting and it's also like high quality information. It's very well written. And it's stuff that I don't really see anyone having learned any of this shit in a class. What kind of class in the normal education would you get this sort of
Yeah.
set of multifaceted angles, because usually you get some summary from your country's point of view. Like maybe you're from Spain, you probably know some of the like angle of Spain's interpretation of how that all went down with some of their own propaganda inserted into that. And then if you're British, same thing. If you're French, same thing. If you're American, also same thing. Like we get pitched as the good guys in a certain way. So yeah, really good read. And then because it has so many battles and stuff in it, it's a pretty exciting read as well. Would recommend. It's called American Nations for anyone who's joining chat late.
Yeah, definitely keep me abreast of your perspective on it as you read more. I'm especially interested in your thoughts on the Scots-Irish chapter.
Yeah, my next chapter, this is what the book looks like, by the way, for stream. The regions of the U.S., well, the U.S. and part of Mexico. It's kind of hard to read from the stream, but it's Yankeedom, which is the people we talked about who are very educated and freedom-loving, but also prudish. You've got New France, First Nation areas, which were the natives, Deep South, which was the plantation-based society and also slave-based economy, New France, El Norte, which is like Texas / Mexico / part of California, the Far West, which is basically Montana, Nevada, Wyoming, that big kind of plains area, the left coast, which is Portland, Seattle, Sacramento, San Jose now, and then Midlands, which is kind of like a lot of what we would consider Canadians nowadays, the Toronto, that kind of region. Yeah, and then Greater Appalachia, which that's probably where the Scots-Irish went.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you've also got Tidewater, which is the Jamestown disaster, and then New Netherlands, which later became New York. Super cool. The next chapter for me is Founding the Midlands.
Oh, okay. So you haven't read that one either. Okay, definitely. That's a fun one.
The Midlands. I don't know too much about that region. I think, did you go to school in Texas your whole upbringing?
Yep, I did.
Okay, Texas has very strong state propaganda, unlike many other U.S. states. Texans, when they grow up, they learn two things. Texas is big, and Texas is the best. Those are really important. Also, you're supposed to remember the Alamo at all times, because we were squatting on that property, and we were killed, and that wasn't very nice. So we fought back at them by doing a surprise cheese attack when they were all taking a nap. That makes us the good guys. Yeah. So that's a pretty interesting aspect of how were you educated, chap? What region did you get served propaganda for that makes them look like the good guys? Because we all kind of, we want to romanticize the past, and also for children too. It's kind of gross if you talk about all the atrocities when a lot of people want to give children a relatively safe and happy life. You don't want to depress them too much, so I can understand that angle.
Yeah, how many other states have their own Pledge of Allegiance?
Yeah. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas. Whoa.
Yeah, we had to do it after the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance.
Soon for you, it will be, I pledge allegiance to the DFW airport with their sprawl. DFW airport, because Texas has so much room and there's like nothing there to be in the way of your development, DFW airport is the size of like an entire zip code unto itself.
Yeah.
It's like big. Its own region. It's larger than Rhode Island probably at this point.
Yeah. They actually had a natural gas deposit under it, and they started making money off of leasing it out to natural gas companies. They made pretty good money off of it just because of how much land they had.
Yeah. Say Texan people generally have an attitude of friendly ambition among each other. There's also a decent level of manners and respect. Like you're supposed to address people, yes sir, yes ma'am, kind of in more of the Southern way, which is, it's nice in a sense to respect other people, give them title. And then the live and let live attitude of you stay on your property, I stay on my property. We don't want as much interference. That's part of why Texans will get really uppity about the idea of their guns being taken and stuff. Like that's one of the places where they love their guns, they love their big trucks, they love their big property, big house, like just scaling up whatever they can and living big. It's very core to the identity. Also, that in a sense is kind of connected with the freedom-loving American identity, where you like lots of personal freedoms and you don't really need too much government entanglement. So very libertarian in its attitude.
Yeah, very much so. The political culture is very much about the individual and their wants and needs and ambitions.
One thing that I don't know about that maybe some younger listeners or watchers might know is for people who graduated high school more recently. I see someone in chat said they graduated high school in 2017.
Oh, wow.
The information they received was probably different than what we received, because textbooks do get changed and updated over time. And they were saying that their education wasn't as pro-colonial as ours might have been.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, I would guess that the attitude ends up being more apologetic over time.
Yeah, I could see that.
It doesn't have to, I guess. You could always cover up more stuff.
Well, I mean, you don't have to cover it at all. I mean, the more time that passes since the colonial era, the more other stuff you have to cover. So I wouldn't be surprised if more and more of it just got cut so they could focus on other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I was in high school, actually also in middle school, we very rarely learned history past World War II.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we would just run out of time. You know,
Yeah.
We would have, we'd get through some of the major events, 1700s, 1800s, and then first half of the 20th century, and then semester's over. And that was it.
Mm-hmm.
So never really got to do much besides. Which is too bad, because I was always curious growing up, like, how would our teacher cover some of the more recent stuff? Because a lot of that was still pretty controversial in the 90s.
Yeah.
Vietnam
They're
War
recent
especially.
and sore wounds. I think that's one of the parts of teaching history is, as the people who are involved in it no longer exist, you're more free to talk about how bad it was. Whereas when it's more recent, you want it to kind of be heroic and romantic in a sense, or the information about it is still somewhat contested academically, because there is a lot of false information that gets written about and posted just in history. It's not all true stuff. Some of it's partial truth, some of it's just intentionally dead wrong to try to make yourself out to look better, that kind of thing. So yeah, I would say that was my perspective as well. I didn't really learn too much about anything past World War II, like the Gulf Wars. I don't fucking know what that was, but that was something. You taught me a lot about the Korean War, which didn't learn shit about that in school at all, other than that it happened. Vietnam War, same thing. No idea. Were we the good guys? What was the conflict there? Who's the good guy and the bad guy? I think the TLDR for that one was, Vietnam is when we were fighting communism. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I guess that's the short version.
Yeah.
It's interesting you bring up Vietnam, because one of my expressions of decadence over the past couple months was watching some reaction videos, because that's been a fad for like the past couple of years, I guess. And have you ever seen the movie Platoon?
No.
Really? Oh, you got to watch Platoon. That's a classic. That's like a big milestone movie. It's not just for movies in general, it's very good, but it's especially known as a really good anti-war movie. And it's also known as a very, it's a pretty accurate portrayal of the Vietnam War from a ground level, like from an infantryman's perspective. There were a couple liberties taken, but the director himself was actually a veteran. He had actually been an infantryman in the Vietnam War, and he used his experience as the basis for the events in the movie. So, from what I've read, veterans who have seen it said that it felt very familiar and very real. So a strong recommend there for Platoon. But the reason I bring it up is that some people have created reaction videos of themselves watching Platoon, and a lot of them are younger folks, guys in their 20s generally. And besides just being really interesting, because Platoon is actually like a really intense fucking movie, a lot of people were not prepared for that aspect at all. There's also the fact that a lot of people didn't actually seem to know that much about the war itself, which kind of took me aback. Because when I was a kid in the 90s, like, the Vietnam War was still recent enough to still be a raw, sensitive subject for a lot of people. And to be fair, I was a little biased because I actually had family that I was close to who had fought in the war. So, it was kind of more real for me maybe than somebody who wasn't. But, just even in the broader culture, like, it was still a very common frame of reference for movies, stories, in the media, documentaries, etc. Like, Vietnam still had a big presence in the culture at that time. So the fact that I live in an era now where people are just like, Vietnam, what's that? I wonder what that was all about. That kind of blew my mind a little bit.
Well, I just have that talent sometimes. Yeah, Vietnam War definitely less taught in schools for sure. My grandma's brother, he was like a rotund dude, like a larger dude, someone who you wouldn't really consider to be particularly athletic, but he trained a lot of the like hand-to-hand combat in Vietnam, and holy shit, he is fast as fuck. I've never seen a faster old person in my life. He would like joke around with us and do like fake boxing, and we're like little kids, like 8 or 10 or something, and he can just run circles around us with his insane kung fu moves. It's one of my coolest things. Uncle Gary randomly is a kung fu god. He fought in Nam. I didn't know anything about Vietnam, or if he was a good guy or a bad guy there, or what he did or what his role was, but by God, he knew kung fu. So that was cool.
Man, okay. Well, you've got me really curious now. What is your impression of the Vietnam War? Like, why it was fought, what it was like, etc.
So basically, it was during a period where we were like very high on the ideological warfare between communism and capitalism, and basically trying to stop the spread of that like it was an idea disease. And we didn't really have a close allegiance with the Vietnamese people in particular, but it was like a battleground state in the sense of it felt like we needed to wrestle for the fate of that one. And that's something that I think it shares similarity with a lot of our intervention and shit in Latin America is being afraid of that spread of communism. But I don't really know like how it was decided, how many people we send, or the propaganda we serve. Like, I'm not sure, what would they tell the soldiers to be recruited for the Vietnam War? And was that one where people were drafted?
Yeah, we still had the draft at the time.
That's crazy.
Yeah,
oh yeah, because Muhammad Ali, he refused it, I think, and he's one of the famous people who did.
Yeah, exactly. He ended up going to jail for that. Yeah, actually kind of fucked with his career a bit. Could box for a while.
Damn.
Understandably so. Well, what about the actual fighting in the Vietnam War? What do you know about that?
I know Agent Orange was something that caused a lot of people to be fucked up after it. And same thing, I think, with Uncle Gary. Like, that's one of the adverse effects on just his health over time. So we used a lot of interesting and dangerous chemical shit in that conflict. And then I know helicopters were also a key piece of that one that I don't know if they were used in previous conflicts very much. So that was kind of like the debut of that as an aggressive tech piece that we wove in.
One of the things I noted in the YouTube videos is that people didn't seem to know whether or not it was a conventional conflict. So what is your thought on that?
Conventional as in what case? Like one army fighting the other army?
Yeah, like Korea, World War II.
Yeah, I think it was all guerrilla shit.
Yeah, okay, so you do know that.
Yeah, because I know that there were some people after the Vietnam War who would like wander the woods of the US just because they had learned how to live in the wild and they didn't know how to live in society anymore, because maybe they were stranded from their people or whatever, and they had PTSD, and just being able to live off the land made the most sense to them. So they would just wander the woods of Washington State or Oregon and just figure out how to live off the land because of that. So in that sense, it was a lot less of, okay, now form a line and we're going to shoot at them. It wasn't like that kind of shit. It was more like, oh shit, they're over there in the woods, dot, dot, dot. Like they just shot at us in a small skirmish kind of capacity. But then also probably some like slash and burn stuff too, of just destroying parts of forest and stuff that you needed to clear, because it's pretty jungly terrain, yeah? Vietnam?
Yeah. It's pretty heavily, there's a lot of foliage. It's quite thick. Yeah, I think your general impression is pretty accurate then. Yeah, it was a guerrilla war. To the great frustration of the United States military, it was very rare for there to be open confrontation between large American units and large Vietnamese units. The Vietnamese knew that they would not win those battles, and so they tended to avoid them unless they perceived an opportunity. Yeah, it was said by a commentator that, well, specifically after the war, there was an American officer who was at some kind of conference about the war, well after the fact, and he met with a Vietnamese veteran who had fought for the communists, and he noted to the Vietnamese guy that we won all of the battles in the Vietnam War, and his counterpart noted, yeah, you did, but you still lost. It didn't matter that you won all the battles. So that really characterizes the war in a nutshell, and I think that was the really frustrating thing, not only for the U.S. military, but for American society, because American society was expecting the United States to just go in, crush the bad guys, and leave. But it was not that kind of a war. It was really more of a political struggle for the fate of Vietnam. And that was an entirely different framing than the framing that the war had in the United States, where it was basically just the U.S. going in and trying to destroy some totalitarian authoritarians who were trying to take over a country. That was the general impression that a lot of people had. And also a lot of people suspected that communists all over the world were being secretly controlled by the Soviet government. So whenever communists seemed to be gaining control of a territory or a country, that was not seen as a civil war or a political dispute within that country. That was seen as an explicit expression of Soviet expansionism. They believed that was an example of the Soviet Union trying to expand its control to other countries. So very different framing then than what we ended up with later. Even during the Cold War, it changed radically. That is to say, our framing of the struggle with the Soviet Union. Like, people didn't really believe so much that communists everywhere were controlled by the Soviets after the Vietnam War ended. You could definitely still find those people, but that sentiment did not maintain its gravitas and authority within decision-making circles in the government after the war. The perspective very much shifted and became much more nuanced. But unfortunately, that shift had not happened when the war started. People were still very much thinking in sort of binary absolutist terms. If communism expands to this place, then de facto the Soviet Union has annexed that place. And that's going to encourage more expansionism and possibly eventually a war. So there was a very determined effort by successive administrations in the United States to take a hard line on what they perceived to be communist expansionism. And in turn, that translated into a determined effort to try to prevent communists from coming to power. They were not seen as authentic representations of domestic opinion pretty much anywhere. They just saw them as liars being used as proxies by the Bolsheviks in Russia. So that was why there was so much opposition to communist expansion as it was seen at the time in the early part of the Cold War. And also, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the domino theory. Have you heard of that?
I can just guess based on what dominoes are, but no.
Yeah, you can probably intuit it, right? It's not ambiguous. So the idea was that if one country in Southeast Asia fell, quote unquote, fell to communism, then the rest of the region would follow one by one. So there was a sense that not only did the United States need to prevent communists from taking power to prevent Soviet expansionism, they also needed to do it because if they failed, then there would be a cascading effect where they would invariably lose even more countries. So that was the American understanding at the time, and that was the impetus for U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Now, an undersold aspect of the Vietnam War is the Vietnamese perspective, which hardly anybody talks about because, most of the sources are in Vietnamese, and most people, well, generally the interested parties are American, maybe Australia or one of the other countries involved, but generally when people are asking about the war, they're American, and so they're interested in American perspectives. So the Vietnamese perspective kind of gets lost in the shuffle, which is unfortunate because the Vietnamese perspective is, of course, the most important perspective to understand if you want to understand the war, certainly its outcome.
What's their country?
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. But you know how Americans are. We tend to make ourselves the centerpiece of any conflict, even if it's not our conflict. So the Vietnam War, at its heart, was not actually a struggle between democracy and capitalism. Between democracy and communism, or between communism and capitalism, or however you would want to frame the struggle. It was actually about decolonization. That was the Vietnamese perspective. And that's a much more accurate description of the conflict than any other. And the disparity between the American perception of the conflict as a Cold War ideological conflict and the Vietnamese perspective of the conflict as one of decolonization explains why the United States and its allies in Vietnam had so much trouble winning the war. More specifically, why they had so much trouble building popular support for the South Vietnamese government amongst the broader population in South Vietnam. Because for the Vietnamese, the United States was just one more foreign power that was trying to dominate the country against the will of the majority. In that sense, there really was not a whole lot the United States was going to be able to do. Maybe if we'd been able to make the South Vietnamese government very effective, representative, not corrupt, very effective in fighting the communists in the war, and also just more sympathetic to the plight of the villagers and the peasants in the country. Maybe if we had done all of those things very well, the South Vietnamese government could have built up enough legitimacy to stand on its own legs without foreign assistance. We didn't do any of that. It did not happen. The United States government tried to make it happen, but in the end, kind of like with the Afghan government that we supported over the course of the Afghan war, the South Vietnamese government was too corrupt, too inefficient, and too averse to confrontation with the communists in the country for the most part, certainly amongst the regulars in the South Vietnamese army, especially earlier in the Vietnam War, to ever really be an effective entity in terms of governing the territory. So the result is that as the war went on, the government just had more and more trouble justifying its existence in the face of all of this determined opposition, not only from communists in South Vietnam, but from the North Vietnamese government. Yeah, I think we've talked before about the history of the French in Vietnam.
Yeah.
It was a while ago.
Vietnamese sandwiches. I was explaining this to Trisha. The reason that Vietnamese food is so good is because they have all the best of fancy French European cuisine, and then all the best of their Southeast Asian, access to different peppers and spices and culinary ideas. Their food is amazing. So good job, Vietnamese people, with your banh mi. I had one of those on the first day of the drive down from Seattle to LA for our move. But yes, I've realized that the French were mostly involved there, and you said Thailand was the buffer state between them and the British control. Yeah. What country?
Burma.
Burma, right.
Yeah, which was to the west of Thailand. Yeah, the French controlled Indochina, which included Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And, long story short, Japan basically took those territories during World War II. They didn't fight for them. They actually just made the French government give them up. The French were not in a position to say no on account of the occupation in Europe. But the Japanese ended up with them. Vietnamese nationalists took up arms against them, and that was the formation of the Viet Minh, the Vietnamese nationalists, which were de facto led by the Vietnamese communists. And once the Japanese were defeated, there was a question of what would happen to the territories that they had occupied. Would they become independent, which is what the Viet Minh wanted, or would the French come back and retake the territory that had technically legally been theirs before the war started? So, of course, the French wanted to come back, and when they tried to against the will of the Vietnamese and the other people in Indochina, the result was the Indochina War, which was a long, protracted conflict over the course of the 1950s, I think specifically the early 50s, that was fought by the French government against the Viet Minh. And they lost. Again, long story short, there's more to it than that. But the French were defeated. They had a big decisive defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And the subsequent Treaty of Paris negotiated a settlement in which basically all of the countries that had comprised French Indochina became independent. So Cambodia became independent, Laos became independent, and Vietnam was actually split in half. So North Vietnam became its own country, and then South Vietnam became its own country. So the Viet Minh controlled North Vietnam, and then there was a nationalist independent government that was set up in the South. Now, what happened is that part of the agreement was that there would be elections a couple years after the Treaty of Paris, in which North Vietnam and South Vietnam would vote in a referendum to determine whether or not they would reunify. So the split was not intended originally to necessarily be permanent. There was potential for it to be permanent, but there was supposed to be a vote about whether they would reunify. And unsurprisingly, the dictator that took power in South Vietnam was not interested in that referendum being an honest one, because the suspicion was that probably unification would win that vote, and that the Viet Minh would gain control of South Vietnam again. And given that the Viet Minh were, again, dominated and controlled by communists, that was not an acceptable outcome for the South Vietnamese government or for the American government. So the South Vietnamese government rigged the poll, and that was the end of it. But that basically was just the initiation for a new stage of the conflict, basically the beginning of what would become the Vietnam War, wherein Vietnamese communists in the north, the North Vietnamese government, rather, started supporting communists in South Vietnam as they tried to overthrow the government. And there was an escalating guerrilla war that the South Vietnamese government was very clearly losing over the course of the late 1950s and then into the early 1960s, despite escalating amounts of American assistance, not direct intervention, but American financial aid, military aid, and also a significant number of advisors which were flown into the country. Despite all of that, like, the South Vietnamese government was not winning. Like, it just was not legitimate. It did not have the support of the public, and the communists were just gaining ground everywhere. Like, effectively, the government didn't really govern much of anything beyond the major cities. You know, the rural areas were pretty well dominated by the communists early in the conflict.
I have one interjecting question, because it sounds like the theme of this is the Vietnamese hadn't had the opportunity to govern themselves for quite some time, so they're pretty high on the corruption scale and low on the government development and faith in institutions scale. When was Vietnam last an empire of itself before the French messed with it?
The French pretty much annexed it in the 1880s.
1880s, that's pretty recent.
Yeah, it was not colonized until sort of the latter period.
I didn't know France was still colonizing shit at that point.
Oh, yeah.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, you might be surprised. That's not necessarily unique. You might be surprised just how recent a lot of European conquests actually were. Like, if you look, have you ever heard of the Treaty of Berlin? That was the one where Africa was divided up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So before that treaty, European control of Africa was actually super sporadic. It was almost exclusively on the coasts, and generally it was just a couple of ports and then maybe some slivers of territory. Like, the vast majority of Africa was not controlled by any Europeans before that treaty. It was only really after that substantive control was asserted in the interior, and even then it was pretty limited. So that was 1880s as well. Vietnam, just relatively recent.
Right, because the book we were talking about earlier, we're talking about 1600s of when people are colonizing shit, and this is 200 plus years later.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but even like then, those early colonies in the 1600s were largely commercial outposts. They were not necessarily directly controlled by the European governments in question. I think the Portuguese were the only exception in that regard. They actually did take territory in a couple places. But even then, that was largely negotiated. Like, they generally didn't have the power to actually seize a whole lot. But the British and the Dutch and the French and some of the other major trading powers, generally they would just negotiate the right to set up what was effectively a warehouse on their territory, and they would purchase land to build those. And that land belonged to the company legally, but technically it was still the sovereign territory of whatever kingdom or ruler that they had negotiated with. But because those territories ended up becoming the kernel of what would later become European empires, people kind of now, after the fact, treat those territories as extensions of European empire, when in fact it was actually more of an ambiguous situation on the ground in terms of control. Yeah, in terms of formal European control of a lot of the territories in which they commercially expanded to and dominated in the 1600s and 1700s, direct rule generally didn't happen until the late 1700s at earliest. Much more commonly, it happened in the early mid-19th century. So in the case of India, for example, the British East India, actually it was the English East India Company, wasn't it? The English East India Company did not actually directly govern any territory in India until the 1760s, I believe. Well, I guess, okay, there was Bombay, whatever. The English got Bombay as a result of a marriage between an English king and a Portuguese princess, and part of the dowry was Bombay. So yeah, there was a couple Portuguese territories that the English controlled directly, but other than that, in terms of like substantive direct control of a large, wealthy territory that would come to form the core of the British Empire in India, the first real case was Bengal, and that wasn't until the 1760s.
Is Bombay, Mumbai? Is that the same thing?
Yeah, same thing.
Okay.
Yeah, they renamed it Mumbai in like the 90s, I think. Yeah, it was a nationalist thing. And people were not even that supportive of it. You know, it was kind of a conservative nationalist thing that was divisive, but most people just kind of went along with it, and it's stuck. But you can still find a lot of people that actually still call it Bombay, specifically locals. You know, for them, like even a lot of the local buildings and stuff are still use the name Bombay. They didn't switch over to Mumbai. Yeah, that's a whole political thing in India. But yeah, India did not really like substantively get incorporated into the British Empire until the early 19th century. And it did not become directly controlled by the British government, completely controlled directly by the British government until after the Sepoy Revolt in the 1850s. And so you only really see like a totally nationalized English East India Company government in the 1850s, 1860s. So the early part of European empire in the 1600s and 1700s, it's only kind of sort of an empire. It's more of an informal commercial empire in which they used their wealth to significantly influence politics in the countries they traded with. But there wasn't as much direct territorial control, and generally European governments delegated a lot of authority to the companies to kind of manage their own affairs. So it was way different than what it would become in the late 19th century, where you had where you had European governments directly governing broad swaths of the developing world, in Asia, Africa, etc. That was a relatively recent thing historically, and it was that era where most of the abuses happened. There definitely have been abuses before that, but in terms of like proselytizing, in terms of destroying local culture, in terms of trying to uproot traditions that were seen as barbaric. Most of that happened after 1850. And that was really sort of the catalyst for a lot of early nationalist movements in those territories.
That's cool. That's refreshing my whole perspective on the phases of exploration / colonization. Because I was under the impression that the push for colonization east and west sort of happened at the same time. Dates are hard with history. That's one of the things, but you kind of get a general sense of what's happening in each decade for each country as you know more and more about history. But I guess my question is, what caused that wave of colonization in that time period? Or was it just the consistent crawl of, okay, we've had a navy for a long time, so we sail around and we see what's up and we kind of see which rocks are willing to roll and which territories we can influence, trade with, or take control over?
Are we talking like 1600s?
I'm saying like in this phase of colonizing Africa and India and Asia, like was there a reason why that was happening, or I don't know.
Well, I guess which phase do you mean?
Yeah. The let's say this phase of expanding into Asia, since we're talking about Vietnam.
Oh, 1880s. Okay, like late 19th century.
Yeah.
Okay. What instigated that? Part of it was religion, in the case of the French in Indochina, because Jesuit missionaries had made a lot of inroads there. So it kind of gave them an in. But more specifically, I guess there was two things I would point to in the case of Southeast Asia. One of them is a factor that affected like the whole world and was not specific to the region, but another one was region specific. So the region specific reason is that there was a lot more trade with China happening. You know, the Second Opium War had basically only recently ended, relatively speaking. It had been like, 20 years before or whatever. And that pretty much opened China to trade completely, which had not been the case before. Mm-hmm. So there was a huge surge in interest in trading with China and trying to take advantage of it. And one of the things that people wanted to do was to find a new way. Specifically in Southeast Asia, they wanted to find a river that led to the interior of China. You know, it was suspected that maybe the Mekong River or maybe another river nearby might actually have its headwaters somewhere up in western China somewhere. And it was thought that if they could take territory in Southeast Asia, specifically Indochina, then they could maybe gain control of that hypothetical river and then have a new route into China with which they could use to dominate commerce with China and take advantage of that big China trade. Mm. So that was one of the factors. As it didn't end up panning out, but that was one of the nominal impetuses for the French to try to move into Indochina at that particular time.
Gotcha, makes sense.
The other big factor is that there was just a scramble. You know, you've probably heard the phrase "scramble for Africa." So there was just a big surge of interest in imperialism over the course of the 1880s. You know, governments in Europe at that time were heavily realist in terms of their outlook as far as international relations. And there was certain upstart powers, like Germany in particular, that were very interested in trying to gain new colonies. Because at that point, that was seen as what you were supposed to do, right? You needed that for access to natural resources, which you could use to power industrialization. A lot of territories had already been taken by the French or the British, or maybe also the Dutch and Portuguese. And so a new power like Germany found itself in a disadvantage. They felt that they needed colonies in order to, get imports of natural resources, but there weren't a lot of colonies left to be had. So there was a big push then, specifically by Germany and maybe some other powers, to try to gain what was left. And that created a competitive atmosphere that put pressure on the pre-existing powers like Britain and France to try to up their game to ensure they didn't lose out too much from this big push by Germany and other new powers to try to get new territories. So that was the big scramble for Africa, and that also kind of played out in places like Southeast Asia, where there was a similar desire to lock down territories that had previously not been explicitly under the control of this, that, or the other European power. So in that sense, European conquest in this period was not actually just about resources per se. It was actually more about the strategy of denying resources to a rival.
I see. So once you realize the value of China on the map, it's like, all right, we need to control the territory around that so we can secure that value.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. And India and China, similar points of value, right? Really high quality textile stuff and spices, I guess, would be some of the main reasons.
Kind of depends on the era, because the trade actually evolved significantly over time. At first, India was not seen as the bigger prize. China was too powerful to colonize, so that wasn't even in question over the course of the 1600s and 1700s. So China was not really on the strategic board for European commercial powers in that early commercial period of European expansion. India was, but it wasn't seen as all that valuable because spices were seen as the more valuable resource. And there was more valuable resources you could have by investing money in places like the Western Hemisphere in the Americas, places like the Caribbean and sugar plantations. So when the British lost the race for the Spice Islands in East Asia, India was kind of their consolation prize. India did have importance as an intermediate market. Spices that were grown in the Spice Islands and Southeast Asia would be exported to markets in southern India as well as northern India, and then they would be exported on to other markets in the Middle East or Africa or maybe in Europe even, once European traders started showing up. So for the British to gain control of certain ports and markets there, that was useful. They weren't getting the spices at their origin, but they could buy some spices and other goods in their Indian ports that they couldn't buy elsewhere, and monopolize the trade in those goods with Europe and make a lot of money. So it was a consolation prize, but it was a pretty good consolation prize. The real value of India came later, specifically in the 1700s. And what happened there was, as you mentioned, textiles. That was a bulk trade. It was not like a really high value trade. But because Indian textiles were so good, the English East India Company was able to move a lot of those and make a pretty good profit just on just the sheer volume of trade.
What did they give India for those?
Let's see. So gold, more generically, you could say specie, but gold and silver were sort of the main forms of coinage at that time. And there was actually a problem perceived in the course of the 1700s with a big exodus of specie from Europe, because Europeans were just buying so much stuff from abroad that the base of gold and silver, rare metals rather, in Europe was actually significantly declining, and it wasn't clear how they were going to make it up, or once it ran out, how they would pay for all the stuff that they were trying to import from abroad. So there was a question of how to deal with that. They had the same problem with trade with China, but they just couldn't really do as much with China, again, because it was more powerful. Mm-hmm. And so the solution was drugs. This is where the opium trade got started. Yeah, so opium was grown in Bengal, and then it would be taken from Bengal, generally by British traders or possibly American traders. We were actually pretty prominent in the trade as well. And they would take it to China, and they would sell it for gold or silver or whatever. And then they would take that money and turn around and buy the stuff that they wanted to buy from China to sell in Europe or America. So that was how they made up the trade deficit with India and China. Well, specifically with China. With India, it wasn't as much of a problem. But they were actually importing way more from China than they were from India over the course of the 1700s. Textiles were a good profit generator for the English East India Company, but it wasn't generating nearly as much profit as the valuables from China. So that gets to the crux of your question. What were they buying from India and China? So from India at first, spices and other valuable goods. Later on, it shifted to a bulk textiles trade over the course of the 1700s. And then in the 1800s, it kind of evolved into other stuff that gets more complicated. But the core goods that were traded over the course of the 19th century were indigo, which was a core ingredient for dye, cotton, which was an important input for the nascent textiles industry in Britain, which was emerging as a result of industrialization. Jute, I don't know if you've heard of that.
What's that?
So jute is a fiber that you use to make rope.
Huh.
And in the age of sail, you needed a lot of rope, to put it mildly. So that was a very popular item for countries that needed lots of rope, either for industry or for their shipbuilding industry in particular. So jute was a major export as well. Opium, for reasons that I just described. And I think there was another one, too, that I'm forgetting. It's slipping my mind. But those are the main groups that the West was buying from India over the course of the 19th century. And some of the 1700s. For China, the goods that we were buying were much more valuable. So the three main groups were porcelain, silk, and the third one. I always forget one of the three. Porcelain, silk, and something else. All of them were even made in the same region too, so I shouldn't be forgetting. Porcelain was Jingdezhang. A lot of the silk used for export was Jiangxi. Tea, that's what it was. Somebody in chat pointed out, thank you, chat. Tea, yeah. So tea was the other big one. And, if you study China, this is kind of a tangent of a tangent. If you study tea in China, what you'll realize is that every region of China has its own tea. Like they all kind of have their own tea, and that tea has its own history, and it's got its own little story and culture behind it, and it's a whole thing over there. So what kind of tea then did the West buy from China? Were we just buying like different teas from different regions? No. Actually, most of the tea that was bought from China was bought specifically from Jiangnan, which was the lower Yangtze region. And they even had like a specific commercialized type of tea that they grew pretty much specifically for export that dominated the trade. So when you think of tea imported from China during this period, don't think of it as being like an eclectic mix of different teas from different regions. It was basically just like the bulk basic bitch tea for foreign devils that they were exporting for us. So yeah, porcelain, tea, silk. Those were the big items. They were all very valuable, especially in the late 1700s. Imports of tea from China just exploded. Like you can see a graph and the line just goes practically vertical. Like it just goes nuts. People just really got a taste for it. And keep in mind at that time, tea was not tea like we think of it now. Like if you're American, such as ourselves, a lot of us think of tea. When we think of tea, we think of something like Lipton's iced tea or something like that. And that is very sort of low-grade commercial tea for Americans. That is not the kind of tea that people were drinking back in the 1700s. And that's not the kind of tea that led to an explosion in imports. What they would do is that they would use the tea as like the core ingredient in order to basically add caffeine and a little bit of flavor. But then they would also add milk, sugar, and sometimes even chocolate. So when you think of tea in the 1700s, don't think of like Lipton's iced tea. Think more of like a soft drink, because that's basically what it was. It was basically the first soft drink, and it was wildly popular. The sugar, the sweetness of it, and the caffeine of it, like all together, and chocolate. If they added that, like that drove people crazy. They never had anything quite that good, and it was so popular that it basically destroyed the balance of trade between two continents. That's how wildly popular it was. So that's what the West was importing from China, and that's why the trade deficit was such a problem at the time, to the point that opium was basically the only way they could overcome it.
Interesting. Well, in a sense, they're crazy for drugs too, because caffeine is a drug. Chocolate has more caffeine in it. So you're getting a lot of uppers, and then you're basically selling them downers to afford your uppers.
Yeah, it was... It's one of the only legal drugs.
Yeah. Socially acceptable, too.
Yeah. Like tobacco, caffeine, these are sort of your acceptable narcotics. Alcohol, I guess, effectively, as well. Yeah, I've read that caffeine in that era, in the late 1700s, had a big impact. Well, it could be said, I guess it can't be proven, but it's been hypothesized that caffeine was one of the contributing factors to the Enlightenment over the course of the late 1700s. Obviously, the Enlightenment predates the 1700s, but there was a big explosion of philosophy and great works in this late 1700s in particular. And caffeine has been attributed some responsibility for that, because a lot of guys would just stay up all night, in cafes, just getting buzzed on caffeine, just writing shit tons of, work. Shit tons of books and articles and things, as well as just cafe culture in general was kind of conducive to that. Part of the reason cafe culture took off was because of all these new drinks that were so popular. So all of the cool intellectuals would go and gather in these places and trade ideas and sort of develop what would become modern liberalism.
Yeah, coffee. Do you take caffeine in any way?
I don't. I cut it out of my diet a long time ago.
Huh. So you don't have any soda with caffeine in it?
No. in so much as I drink soda now, it's actually just like root beer.
Okay.
Root beer or ginger ale,
Cool.
which don't have caffeine in them. At least not the ones I drink.
Nice. I did not know that.
Yeah, I kind of cut all sugary drinks out of my diet for a long time, and sometimes I try to go back to that, but I have acquired an unfortunate taste for root beer and ginger ale. So that is a decadent little treat I have sometimes.
Root beer is good. I remember our family would go to, they used to have the Barks, or was it the AMW in Texas? You can get a root beer float there. Those are heckin' good. Or you can make them at home. Breyer's ice cream and root beer. Make them at home. Easy peasy.
Yeah. So, to bring this full circle...
We were talking about Vietnam. We got all the way over to root beer floats.
Yeah, such is the nature of our segment here. Okay, so India and China had very different trade compositions with the West. So I hope that answers your question. Maybe I lost a little bit track of what you were asking.
No, it makes sense. So I was kind of wondering what instigated the colonization in the eastward direction from Europe after the pursuit of the Americas. So it's basically they're going for the Americas, trying to get as much gold and shit as they could. The European countries do acquire a lot of gold through this process between Spain and the Netherlands and England and France. They all get a bunch, and Portugal, they all get a bunch of resources. So then they project those resources in another direction by buying a bunch of weird and interesting local shit that their people are going to be demanding in some way.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I would point out that European expansion into East Asia overlapped with expansion into the Americas in the 1500s. But it was just less dramatic because Eastern empires in the 1500s in particular, also the 1600s, were still sufficiently powerful relative to Europe that Europeans couldn't just like subjugate them like what happened in the Americas. So all the dramatic stuff was happening in the Americas, but there was actually still a lot of exploration and trade links being set up at the same time in Asia over that same time period. Yeah, the one of the dramatic things that happened, just to kind of comment and elaborate on what you just mentioned about resources from the Americas feeding consumption of Asian goods by Europeans, there was actually another knock-on effect that whole process had. Before the Americas were sort of discovered and exploited by Europeans, there was in international trade a shortage of specie. I keep saying that, so that's like gold, silver, just rare metals that you would use for trade, just coinage basically. And that's useful because without coinage and other forms of currency, you have to rely on barter, and that's inherently limiting. If you want something somebody else has, but you don't have anything that they want, you can't trade. So you may have a whole bunch of stuff, but if you don't have anything they want, you can't do anything. Currency allows you to make that trade happen anyway, because you can trade currency for anything with anybody. So the shortage of currency meant that interest rates tended to be higher. People found it more difficult to get loans to do business, and commerce in general had a relatively high barrier to it. And so economies were effectively not running at their full potential because they were just bottlenecked on currency, among other things. So because Europeans were able to discover the Americas and mine the fuck out of them, because there was a huge amount of gold and silver that was mined over the course of the 1500s and 1600s in the Americas, if not also the 1700s. And the result was a massive flood of specie, not only into Europe, but into global trading networks writ large, like globally. And the knock-on effect then was that the global economy, not only in Europe, but everywhere, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, was significantly boosted as a result, because all of a sudden this bottleneck is overcome. Now there is enough coinage and specie generally to allow all of this economic activity to happen that could not happen before just because there was a shortage. And the result is that over the course of the 1500s, there was actually a global economic boom. So Europe was not the only one to benefit from the discovery and conquest of the Americas. Actually, China, India, and other territories as well benefited. because one, they had that influx of specie, and also two, there was the influx of potatoes, which I know sounds weird and boring, but actually was very important.
We sent them some very important potatoes, let me assure you. We explained to them all the nutrients in these potatoes, and that's why we were able to charge such a high price for them.
Yeah, so economic activity exploded because of the money inflow, like the specie inflow, but then potatoes increased the efficiency of farming in broad swaths of the planet, because potatoes are just higher in nutrition than a lot of alternative crops. And so when potatoes were discovered, they were taken from the Americas. That's why it's relevant. So they were taken from the Americas, and then people started planting them in Europe, China, etc. And the result is a population boom in those places. And that's important to consider, too, when talking about an expanding economy, because if you just dump money on an economy, you'll get an improvement to economic performance, especially if there was a shortage of money before. But eventually, you're going to hit a point of diminishing returns, wherein just more money causes inflation and you're not seeing actual substantive increases in output. But if you have a lot of population growth, then you can still keep dumping more money on there in order to take advantage of the new labor pool. More people means more workers and more specialization. That's just how traditional economic development happens. All economies historically started with farming, right? Well, technically hunting and gathering, but whatever. Farming was the main one that built modern civilization. So you had a few people growing all the food, and then that meant that you had a surplus of labor that didn't need to grow food, who could do other stuff. And the result of the introduction of the potato is that the labor surplus grew significantly. So a significant new labor surplus plus a shit ton of extra money that you didn't have before means a massive economic boom. More people were producing more stuff than they ever had before. Mm-hmm. And it was a tremendous boon to quality of living and government revenue everywhere. It was a big earth-shattering thing for that era in the early modern period. It significantly boosted the Ming Dynasty in China. It was one of the reasons the Ming Dynasty became one of the wealthiest in the history of China, because they benefited from that rising tide of global trade. Mm-hmm. It also ended up corrupting the government and eventually leading to the Ming Dynasty's collapse. So, go figure. But they definitely were not hurting for lack of resources in that time period. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that was an interesting knock-on effect of that that import and export of gold and silver from the Americas. It wasn't just about Europeans importing stuff. It was also about a structural change to global trade.
Well, that's
Sorry,
cool.
Anyway, that's another tangent. Yeah, that was the way you described it is the general layout of the trade between East and West at that time. Mm-hmm. But in the late 19th century in particular is when interest in Indochina's peaked enough for the French to actually make a move and conquer the territory.
Cool. This all started from talk about the Vietnam War. Nice.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what we're building to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of the background. So that's how the French got into Indochina. They stayed there. They killed the nationalists when they started to agitate for independence, and that meant that the only alternative was the communists. So the communists came to become the natural leaders of the independence movement, which is why they came to dominate the Viet Minh. Mm-hmm. Which the French probably didn't see as a problem, because they assumed that they were going to stay in Indochina forever. Mm-hmm. And they figured that they could crush the communist resistance just like they crushed the nationalist resistance. But history called time on the French Empire in Indochina, and they ended up leaving. And so then the United States ended up inheriting the mess. And obviously, we were not able to suppress the communists. Mm-hmm. In our defense, the French probably would not have either. The French were not in a position to really continue occupying Indochina. That much was clear by the 1956 Treaty of Paris. But that speaks to the decline of French influence of the region, and that was the ascendancy of the nationalist movement that would try to fight for and eventually would win an independent, unified Vietnam. So the Vietnamese, the perspective of the West was that the North Vietnamese government should respect the Treaty of Paris, that they should allow the referendum for unification to go forward and respect the result. even though the result in the South was heavily, obviously rigged. And so when the North Vietnamese government started supporting communist rebels in the South that were trying to take over the government, that was received very poorly in the West, especially in the United States. They saw that, again, as Soviet expansionism. And so they believed it was the duty of the United States to resist that. And so the United States started supporting the South Vietnamese government by providing them weapons, advisors, etc., as well as financial aid. So that was the war from 56 to roughly 1965. And there was some drama in the interim, but most of that was domestic political drama in South Vietnam. I think we've talked before about how President Diem, who was the dictator of South Vietnam in the late 1950s, was stupid about governance. Like, the CIA told him, we know you're going to have a presidential election. We know you're going to rig it. So
don't rig it too much. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, that was the guy. So,
and he was like, I'm super going to rig it way too much.
Yeah, that's what happened. And he was also Catholic in a country that was majority Buddhist, and that would not have been a problem, save for the fact that he discriminated against Buddhism, which was an extra special stupid move, given his precarious position. So that led to a lot of Buddhists protesting against him. Liberal Democrats protested against him. Obviously, the communists and nationalists protested against him. The guy had no substantive constituency. Maybe the only group in South Vietnam that actually supported him were the Catholics, and they were a minority. So that was not nearly enough in order to maintain the government's legitimacy. So eventually, some generals in the South Vietnamese military approached the CIA and said, hey, we would like to depose this man because he's a fool and set up a new military junta. Will you let us do that? Or more accurately, what would you do if we did that? And the CIA said, well, nothing. We'll kind of allow that. They actually did have to go to President Kennedy and ask for permission. They didn't just decide themselves. And Kennedy, interestingly, was actually very hesitant because he was concerned that, the precedent set by assassinating a president would be very bad.
Hey guys, wait, isn't assassinating people wrong?
Yeah, he actually told the CIA to tell the coup plotters not to kill him. He wanted Diem to be basically sent into exile. And both Kennedy and the CIA were actually surprised when the coup happened, and Diem was actually just executed pretty much on the spot.
Whoa.
Yeah. So a little bit of foreshadowing there for Kennedy, unexpectedly so. But once Diem was gone, the new military junta was not that much better. Like, they were better about not, just openly discriminating against the majority religion in the country. They were not that level of stupid. But where they really struggled was in terms of corruption. Like, the government was very obviously corrupt. Like, it was impossible to just kind of get by without bribing public officials. The military as an institution in South Vietnam was also corrupt. Like, it was not uncommon for people to just bribe their way out of military duty. Or alternatively, it was not uncommon for people to bribe their way into high-paying jobs as officers in the military, which obviously does not reward merit. So the officer corps in the South Vietnamese military was not very good for a very long time, correspondingly. And a lot of the soldiers themselves were conscripts, and so they didn't really feel particularly compelled to fight for the South Vietnamese government because they were being forced to fight. They were not volunteers. So, an unpopular, illegitimate, foreign-backed government drafts you to fight against your countrymen who are trying to unify it with your other countrymen in a country to the north that was just artificially separated from you. In those circumstances, you're not going to fight very hard. A lot of guys did not. It was not their priority. That changed by the early 70s, but by then, the die was pretty much cast, and there wasn't really much that was going to stop the inevitable, short of full return of U.S. involvement, which was not politically viable at that point. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, late 50s, early 60s, 1956 to 1965. It was still mostly a civil war between the South Vietnamese government and dissidents, specifically communists backed by the Viet Minh in North Vietnam. So that seemed all the world to outsiders in the United States like foreign aggression, given that they're supposed to be separate countries that respect each other's borders, so more and more aid was sent. And eventually a tipping point was reached in 1965, because that was when American air bases in South Vietnam which were a recent thing. Like they had recently set up American air bases so that the United States could provide air support to the South Vietnamese army fighting in the country. And again, this is a guerrilla war, so there's no front line per se. But whenever units encounter insurgents or rebels or whatever, they would call in air support. But South Vietnamese air support was obviously pretty thin because they didn't have the resources for that. So the United States started providing it instead. So from the communist nationalist perspective, those air bases are totally legitimate targets. And so they started, shelling them, well, more specifically, mortaring them. And that led the United States government to argue, well, why can't we send troops to South Vietnam to protect our air bases? That was the original argument. They weren't going to go fight the war for South Vietnam. They were just going to protect American air bases. And protection came to be interpreted pretty liberally over the course of the next year or two. Originally, it was just patrolling around the bases, but eventually it turned into search and destroy missions where they would actively go into areas where they suspected there were a lot of communists and then try to find them and fight them in so much as they could. So that was the initiation of the American involvement on the ground in South Vietnam. And of course, the Viet Cong, which were the nationalist rebels fighting against the South Vietnamese government, they called themselves nationalists. The United States tended to think of them as just communists. Potato, pretty much the same thing at that point in South Vietnam. But again, that comes down to that reflects the difference in framing between the Vietnamese and the Americans in the conflict. But regardless, the initiation was the attacks on American air bases. Eventually, the Johnson administration decided they wanted to significantly escalate American involvement because the South Vietnamese government was very clearly losing the war, and they didn't think they could continue on without American help on the ground, substantive help on the ground. So the American people were not entirely on board with a major ground war in Asia, and the Johnson administration knew that, so there needed to be kind of a casus belli to justify significant escalation. And so that turned into the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Are you familiar with that?
No.
So the Gulf of Tonkin incident was an incident that, did actually happen, but was blown way out of proportion, in which an American warship that was sailing in the Gulf of Tonkin, which, by the way, is right next to North Vietnam, and was attacked by basically North Vietnamese coastal defense forces. Some smaller Vietnamese ships fired on them. And so the Johnson administration, used that as an illustration of aggression and hostility by the North Vietnamese government that justified American retaliation, and that retaliation, quote unquote, took the form of a significant escalation in American involvement on the ground in South Vietnam, which is what they'd originally wanted. So the Gulf of Tonkin incident was kind of a fig leaf for something the administration wanted to do anyway, and it later turned into a kind of mini scandal. Specifically for opponents of the war, it turned into a big scandal. They cited it as the government using duplicitous methods to try to trick the American public into fighting a war that they did not need or want. And the Gulf of Tonkin incident has become sort of a watchword for government duplicity and misdirection vis-a-vis foreign policy ever since. Less so in the past couple decades, because we've got new incidents to use for that role. But before that, Gulf of Tonkin was very well known in that regard and commonly used. So that marked the beginning of significant ground operations that were offensive in nature for the United States. And so this is actually where you get the first major battle the United States fights in Vietnam, which was the Battle of Ia Drang, which a famous book was written about. I think it was something like We Were Soldiers Once and Young Too, something like that. I don't recall exactly the title, but it was a well-regarded book about the Vietnam War and about that battle in particular. And it was actually adapted into a pretty good movie as well. So I would recommend that if you haven't seen that. So pretty good Vietnam movie. So this is where things really start going for the United States in Vietnam. At this point, we're sending, I think, something around 60 to 100,000 troops to Vietnam. And they engage not only in defending American air bases, but they are also part of just the general war effort that the South Vietnamese government is fighting against the rebels. And at first, it was basically just about going and finding them. The idea at first was, if we can kill enough of them quickly enough, then we can just attrit opposition forces to the point where they can no longer fight, and they'll eventually have to come to the negotiating table. And for generals in the United States military, the best way to generate enemy casualties was to fight big, decisive battles with them. So the impetus at first was just to try to go out, make contact with the Viet Cong, wherever they could be found, and then to fight a big battle with them where they were just destroyed. And given American superiority in weapons and whatnot, odds were pretty heavily in America's favor in that regard. So that was our strategy, and it failed miserably because the Viet Cong, noting that they would get crushed in a general open battle, avoided them, as I said before. Mm-hmm. And that resulted, instead of just big battles that were decisive in nature, just a series of skirmishes and hit-and-run attacks and sabotage, assassination, etc. Just all manner of little things. Basically, the Viet Cong bleeded the United States and the South Vietnamese army as best it could. Now, they still took way more casualties than the U.S. The U.S. just had so much firepower. In those cases where they were found, whether they wanted to be found or not, and were attacked, they generally got the worst of it. And even in the cases where they initiated significant confrontations, they tended to come off the worst. But they didn't have to inflict more casualties than they took. It was enough from their perspective just to bleed the United States in general, because their strategy was to just drag out the war as long as possible until the United States just decided it wasn't worth it anymore. Mm-hmm. So little pinprick attacks over time add up pretty significantly, not only in terms of their military cost and financial cost, but also in terms of their political cost.
Yeah, chip damage.
Yeah. So from the start, the Vietnamese strategy was one of just bleeding the United States, just slow attrition. And the United States found that very frustrating, specifically the U.S. military and the U.S. military command in Vietnam, because they just could not generate these big battles that they'd wanted, and that were a core part of their strategy. So eventually what they did is they started turning to quotas. The idea was give quotas to low-level units of Viet Cong to kill. And if we can meet those quotas, then we'll have killed enough Viet Cong to mathematically be in a winning position such that they cannot maintain their war effort.
It's a very brutal category for deciding your objective.
Well, I mean, you can guess what happened, right? Quotas are very inefficient because they incentivize lying. So if you have a quota to meet,
or killing civilians.
Well, that's what happened, right?
Yeah.
You go out and you either misidentify people who are already dead for whatever reason as people that were Viet Cong who you killed, or you just go and kill people and say that they were Viet Cong whether they were or weren't. Mm-hmm. And so that was a contributing factor to a lot of the atrocities that were committed by both the South Vietnamese army and the United States military in Vietnam. They had this, South American leadership at that time had a very granular quantitative approach to planning and strategy that did not translate well to the type of war that Vietnam was. If it were a conventional war, it might have worked better, but Vietnam was an unconventional war. And in guerrilla wars, politics, legitimacy, policy, corruption, these things are sort of the main battlefields. These are the things you need to focus on. And as foreigners, we were not well disposed to fight on those battlefields because we just didn't know. We didn't know Vietnam. We didn't know the culture. We didn't know the people. We barely knew the politics. We just tried to kind of parachute into another country's conflict and tried to kind of wing it, America style. Like, if we just work hard enough, we can solve the problem. That's very much an American perspective. And that's what they tried to do in Vietnam, even though they were just not prepared for it. And, the results spoke for themselves, especially early in the war. I don't know. Do you know Robert McNamara?
No.
He was Secretary of Defense in the United States in the early part of the American involvement in the Vietnam War, 65 on to 68 or so. And he was a whiz kid. He was one of Kennedy's whiz kids, I think. And he was well known for being really good at math, really good at logistics. He made a name for himself doing planning for the Ford Company, I think. And he'd done a lot of good things for them, just through his use of quantitative methodology to improve their business practices. So he was a smart guy. So bring him into the Secretary of Defense position, give him responsibility for war planning, and see what he can do. The thinking was that he was eminently qualified to do that, but he took such a mathematical quantitative approach that he totally just ignored all of the other soft factors. Like, he was not the guy. He was the wrong guy at the wrong time for the United States in his role as Secretary of Defense. I don't know that there was any alternative because, again, the perspective in political culture in the United States at that time was very much of boosting and listening to people like that. So, it probably would have been the same whether he was there or not. But McNamara ended up getting the blame for that. All of these failed policies like the quotas and whatnot, and the just overly rigid approach to dealing with what was a complex, nuanced local problem. McNamara got the blame for all of that, especially in the early part of the war. And anti-war activists, to this day, the ones that are still alive, still blame him for a lot of that. I had a anti-war professor when I was in college who had been a big member, not a big member. She had been a participant in the anti-war movement. And even when she was just talking about the Vietnam War and Robert McNamara just from memory, like she couldn't really hide her bile. Like she was still mad about it, even all those decades later. So the American experience at this time was one of just paramount frustration. The United States was trying to fight a conventional war in a very unconventional setting. It was very much trying to jam a square peg through a round hole. And, in typically belligerent American style, we were just really trying to force it. If it wasn't working, then we just need to try harder. So we kept dumping more men, more material into the conflict. So by 1968, the United States had, which was the height of American involvement in terms of the deployment of troops, the United States had more than 500,000 troops in South Vietnam.
Wow. And
mind you, South Vietnam was not a big country. Right. Geographically speaking, it wasn't that big, but in terms of demographics, the population was circa 10 million. So 500,000 troops in a country of 10 million, that's a lot. That's what is that? That's like 5% of the population at that point. So suffice to say, American influence on the culture was pretty significant in that time period, although a lot of that has significantly disappeared because of the nationalist communist retribution after the war ended. But that was later. But in 1968, the military had said, we think we can do this, but they had told the government so many times that they just needed more troops and more time that by 68, 500,000 troops. But by 68, the public and the government were getting exasperated because, it was basically just like Iraq, if you remember that. The government kept saying 6 more months and it'll be fine. We just need more time. And then 6 months later, well, we're still not ready yet. More time, 6 more months, more troops. Don't worry about it. Don't think about it. Just trust us. And they just kept doing that over and over again until the public's trust in the conflict and in the government's management of the conflict had totally disappeared.
Yeah.
So by 1968, they had pretty much reached that point. The anti-war movement had reached fever pitch. There were mass protests. And I would point out, too, that it was not just hippies and the left that were protesting the war. The anti-war movement was actually pretty broad-based. The most hardcore conservatives were still pro-war, but even a lot of moderate conservatives had turned against it by that point. They didn't see what the point was. They didn't see what the end point was. They didn't understand what the strategic significance of the conflict was. Just overall, it didn't seem like it was worth it to a lot of people by 1968.
Yeah, it's also one of those that for the people who are just your basic troops in the conflict, it doesn't have a long history of building up an emotional reason for fighting there. Like, you're an American citizen, you are now in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and you're supposed to kill some of them, and you're allied with other ones. It's not a history of we're defending our land or whatever. You're just being drop shipped into the jungle, and it's a lot more difficult to justify for just the dispensation of direct violence. I think that's the mistake that I guess you could say we made twice, probably more times in the course of history, of being able to win a conventional battle. Like you said, we won all the conventional battles in Vietnam, but we still lost because we didn't anticipate the counterinsurgency period and how long and grueling that is, and how maybe it's impossible to win because the people are rooted to the land. That's their land, they want to live there, so they're going to resist you, and over time, whenever you can't afford to be there anymore, they're going to win the long game. So having more of an awareness of that, and instead maybe, I don't know, equipping people with more so trade and ideas and stuff, and give them a reason to be on your side. Because for Vietnam, they've basically got foreign powers that are heavily interested in their political alignment, maybe more so than they would be on their own. The average Vietnamese citizen at that time probably was neither gung-ho communist, nor were they gung-ho capitalist. They're like, these are countries that are very high anxiety about these political ideas. So they are fighting over us. They're fighting over our fate so that they can have their sphere of influence include our country. So, yeah, definitely doesn't seem like a very fun conflict from the Vietnamese perspective.
No, it was not. It was pretty brutal. And again, from their perspective, it was more of a civil war. You know, generally, Southern elites, specifically Catholics in particular, although not all Catholics were elites, there were lots of poor Catholics as well. Generally, they were the most anti-communist. But everybody else was either undecided or thoroughly Viet Cong / Viet Minh. Sentiment was heavily in their favor. But I've been talking about the conflict from a pretty strategic perspective, like sort of big picture view. The conflict is remembered more for the local stuff. People still argue about the big picture stuff. There's some room for debate there, but the conflict is remembered more for the difficulty and brutality of the fighting on the ground. Not all of South Vietnam was covered in jungle. A lot of it is just forest, subtropical forest. There were basically like 3 zones, you could say, of South Vietnamese geography. The southern zone was the Mekong Delta, and as you might guess, that was very wet, very fertile. There was, some jungle there, but there was also, it was sort of disrupted by a lot of plantations. There were a number of rubber plantations in the lower Mekong in that period. So it was built up, heavily populated, and it was also very close to the border with Cambodia, which was a problem because a lot of supplies and weapons and personnel from North Vietnam would be smuggled out of North Vietnam through routes that ran through Laos and Cambodia. So anything close to the border with either of those countries was generally a hotspot for Viet Cong activity because that was very close to their supply line. So even though southern South Vietnam and the capital Saigon was actually the furthest away from North Vietnam, it was still a very active conflict zone in the war. Because it was so close to the Cambodian border. Yeah, you can see it on the map there. Ho Chi Minh City is what they call Saigon now.
Right. Wait, we call it Ho Chi Minh City or they call it Ho Chi Minh City?
Sorry, they call it. They changed the name from Saigon to Ho Chi Minh City after the war ended.
Gotcha. And then, so that was the southern region that you talked about, and that's the like delta kind of landscape. And then Hanoi is the what kind?
Well, I'm not talking about North Vietnam, just South Vietnamese geography has 3 zones.
Oh, gotcha.
So southern South Viet, you can roughly drag a line east-west at the midway point of Vietnam. And the north of that was the previous border of North Vietnam, and south of that was what was then South Vietnam. So the most southern part of South Vietnam was the Delta. The middle part was the Central Highlands. And that was kind of a hilly / mountainous territory, which was heavily forested, but also much less populated. So there tended to be less political activity and more actual fighting there. In the south, there was fighting as well, but the Viet Cong were able to use a lot of infiltration tactics to move into villages that did not support the government or that were, shall we say, vulnerable to coercion. But in the Central Highlands, that wasn't as much a thing. In the Central Highlands, it was just more about maneuvering, setting up secret hideouts, bases from which to operate, that kind of thing. The upper part of South Vietnam was the part that actually bordered North Vietnam and the DMZ between them. And that was also pretty hilly, but also tended to be more coastal and dry.
Oh, so relatively easier to maneuver than the dense forest or jungle.
Yeah, a bit. So that area in the north tended to be the most heavily fortified because, there was always the potential for North Vietnam to just like launch a conventional invasion of the South. So there was a lot of South Vietnamese and also American bases up there that were trying to act as a filter. Also, they wanted to try to block North Vietnamese people and weapons from moving through across the DMZ into South Vietnam and being smuggled to the rest of the country. That was potentially a major route, but that was largely blocked off because there was so much concentrated firepower there. So the most active zones, as I understand it anyway, were the South and the Central Highlands in South Vietnam. That's where most of the fighting was. although that did vary depending on year. In 1968, there was actually a big amount of fighting in the northern zone, but that actually turned out to be a distraction.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so when you think about guys fighting in the jungle, that's more southern South Vietnam generally, because that's generally where more of the jungle was. But if you see like really thick forests and stuff, that was more the Central Highlands.
Yeah, I can see the delta part on the map. I'm looking at satellite mode. It's more of that light green, so not really thick forest. And then in this part, it's a lot more dark green along the coastline. And then North Vietnam is also pretty forested, it looks like. Not right at Hanoi. I guess around it. This is also a delta-looking landscape.
Yeah, the North Vietnamese area has the Haiphong River, and the Haiphong Delta dominates the area around Hanoi. So you can see there's like that big flat built-up area with lots of towns in northern North Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the Haiphong Delta. Or is it the Red River? Maybe I'm getting it wrong. I don't recall all of a sudden. Well, regardless, that's where most of the population and economic activity were. To the south of that, it gets significantly more rugged.
It's an interesting shape of a country. You've got two kind of lumps on either end, but the middle part is pretty slim.
Yeah, well, what happened is that Vietnamese civilization originated in the north, in the delta in the north that you saw around Hanoi. And then in the medieval period, they expanded south along the coastline, because there's not much reason to take a bunch of mountains, right? So you just focus on the coastline because that's where the trading ports are, which you can get tax revenue from.
True.
And so then they moved south, and eventually they conquered the Mekong Delta, because that was very valuable. And at that time, that was controlled by Cambodia. And actually, the original indigenous population was all Cambodian as well. But when the Vietnamese conquered it, obviously there was a big influx of Vietnamese migrants. And so the result is that by the 20th century, most of the population was ethnically Vietnamese.
Did not know that.
So that's why it looks so funky. It's just sort of like a slender coastline country.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were efforts by Vietnam to push over the mountains to the west and take territory that belonged to Thailand, but for the most part, Thailand was able to repulse those efforts and maintain control of their sort of core territory there.
You mean like over the mountains through Laos?
Yeah. Laos was a big battleground between Vietnam and Thailand for centuries.
It's so interesting how we have the geography of the earth and how that's the map that these countries are dealing with when they're fighting for resources and defending territory. I watched Sisu, the movie about the Finnish miner who was like based off of that sniper in the Winter War. I forget his name.
Oh, yeah.
Who had like 300 plus confirmed kills.
Yeah.
And really cool movie. It does take some liberties. It's kind of like a Tarantino movie in terms of the combat.
Yeah.
But very good, very fun to watch. Very low dialogue, but they're able to capture a lot of the emotion of the situation just based on what's happening. So very good, highly recommend. And it's interesting to see how that aspect of the landscape heavily affects how people can maneuver their tanks and their vehicles and all that kind of stuff. And also just feeds into the history of how quickly certain countries fell to conquest. Like Denmark was one of the examples that was mentioned that I looked up recently, where Denmark fell really fast to Germany, partly because their land is just so flat and easily navigable by tanks and heavy machinery and stuff. Like that's very easy to go through, but attacking Switzerland, that's a lot more tricky and ridiculous when you've got huge mountain ranges and stuff. You don't really want to be driving tanks up and down mountains. That's just too fuel efficient and slow and easy to be punished by people hiding in the mountains. So yeah, the landscape of the territory you're defending really is a major factor in what you can potentially defend and what makes it hard to contest control from other people.
Yeah, geography shapes history. It's a big role.
It's part of why the Indian Empire and the Chinese Empire have been pretty distinct from each other. So you've got the goddamn Himalayas.
Yeah, that's a big barrier.
Yeah. And Tibet and all the desert and stuff. Yeah, this was cool to kind of branch different periods of colonial history. We didn't really have time for questions during today's Agent Smith, by the way, chat. Sorry about that, but we were in a really good flow, kind of talking from just referencing the starting point here. The book he recommended, American Nations, which I'll hold it up so you can see what it looks like again. This one is just about the different peoples that arrived at the Americas from the various countries that had ambitions in that direction, and what their motivations were, what their mistakes were. And then you mentioned to me earlier on in the message, the discovery and conquest of Mexico. That was a first-hand account of someone who was with Cortez.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, one of his soldiers.
Yeah. That's crazy high value too. Like, just to be a literate person who's on an adventuring mission like that and you're able to actually write down what happened, that's so much more valuable than word of mouth, because word of mouth ends up getting twisted a lot faster in terms of the integrity of the information. But you write that down, you get that firsthand perspective, and that had to have been scary too. Like, for the adventurers who are going over there, you're going to a land with people you've never met before, you don't speak their language, you don't know their customs, you've got limited supplies, and you're just going to try to survive and get what you can from the situation. So I'm excited to see where this book goes. The next chapter I'm reading is on the Midlands, which is the kind of northern US slash Canada, like the border between the US and Canada around the Great Lakes. Mm-hmm. I guess you could call it the Great Lakes region too. And then you said Appalachia is the Scots-Irish settling there?
Yeah, that's probably my favorite chapter in the book. The whole book is good, but that one stood out to me. Because that's especially is not a history that's much talked about in colonial history in the United States.
Mm-hmm. We did have some background conversation about Israel and Palestine. We didn't get to that tonight, so maybe look forward to that for the next one. But every week,
I can comment on that right now. Status quo.
Status quo, really? Wow.
Status quo.
So it goes. The series of reprisals continues. It turns out people disliking each other and living next to each other results in violence. Let's hope that they can calm down and choose peace moving forward and realize that they are the same species.
That's not politically popular right now. Probably not.
We're trying to win votes over here, and the current stance is very hawkish. So if you could be more hawkish with your respective stances. Yeah, it's interesting that the propaganda is so loud on social media for that conflict. There are other conflicts in the world that we've visited before. There's Burma. There's Sudan. There's also Congo. There's stuff happening with Azerbaijan and Armenia. There's a lot of things going on. So best of luck to everyone. I hope that 2024 is a year that treats us very well. But Agent Smith, this has been an absolute blast. We got all kinds of colonies that we covered today. I feel like we sort of teased the idea of talking about the Berlin Treaty and like the different moves that people made in Africa, but we did cover a lot of the colonization east after the big money boost they got from colonizing west. Yeah,
the British used to call that east of Suez. All the territories east of the Suez Canal in South Asia, East Asia, maybe the Middle East too. Yeah, the phrase was east of Suez. And in 1970, that was a big deal because that was the year they actually withdrew from all of their colonies, quote unquote, east of Suez.
Yeah, and for people, Suez Canal is the one in Egypt right here that goes through. What is this, the Gulf? Red Sea? Is that the Red Sea? Oh, this larger area is the Red Sea. This is the Gulf of something. I like how I zoom in and the text is still tiny. It's the Suez Gulf. Okay, fine. So there's a Suez Gulf, Suez Canal, and that's what gets you from the Mediterranean out
to the Red Sea.
Yeah. To the Red Sea and then to the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. And that gives you access to India and then Bangladesh, Burma, Thailand. Actually, it takes a while to get to China. Would they go all the way around heckin' Singapore to get there?
Yeah, you would have to.
So you go like through Malaysia and Singapore, and then you get up to China and Taiwan and South Korea and Japan.
Yep.
That's far, man.
It's a long trip, but the profits made it worth it for a long time.
Yeah. What were the 3 things they got from China again? It was porcelain, textiles, and tea?
No, porcelain, well, silk specifically was
Silk.
high value. You could get textiles anywhere, but man, Chinese silk was immensely valuable. Because very few other territories in the world had mastered sericulture. Actually getting the fiber out of the silkworms and making cloth out of it. That was a very difficult skill. And China was one of the only places that knew how to do that and knew how to do it at scale. So porcelain goods, silk goods, and tea.
Gotcha.
The soft drink stuff.
Yeah. Give me those uppers with the caffeine plus the chocolate.
Yeah. Wildly popular.
Basically early Starbucks kind of shit. Because I drink coffee black basically all the time. Occasionally I'll get like a bubble tea drink that's like some kind of milk tea with oat milk or something in it. But yeah, I do enjoy coffee, but I don't put stuff in it normally. But people have liked stuff in their coffee historically. Fuzzy Cord did take down some questions, so potentially for next week we can visit those.
Sure.
Also, I'll publish the VOD for this, so you can read the chat for that. And for anyone who joined late, you can see this on YouTube. Give us a comment, give us a compliment, or a scathing review. And
Do we have time for a couple comments?
Yes.
Okay, just a couple end things here.
Yeah.
So I didn't do the usual disclaimer. There's not much point in doing it now, but out of sheer superstition, I'm going to anyway. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about. More painfully obvious at some times than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I do enjoy the feedback and learn a lot from it.
There we go. So now people can't claim that you said that you knew everything this episode. Safe.
Yes. So I wanted to throw that out there. I wanted to tell Fuzzy Cord that he was right about the GDP number that I used the last time we were talking. I mentioned that I was reading a thing online about how the U.S. economy had grown since 2010 by almost, what was it, like 70% or something? And he was skeptical. And he was right to be, because that was nominal GDP growth since 2010, not real GDP growth that was adjusted for inflation.
Oh. Gotcha.
So
inflation would have made that number sound more impressive than it actually is.
If you adjust for inflation, the actual amount of economic growth in the United States since about 2010 has been around 33%.
Okay, so that's still growth, but that's not 70. That's like half.
Yeah.
Cool.
So he was skeptical at the time. He was correct. So well done, sir.
Being skeptical can save yourself from getting into some pretty incorrect ideas.
Very much so. Yeah. Also, watch Platoon. That's a lot of fun.
Oh, Platoon.
I was going to ask, is it possible to watch movies on Discord?
Someone has to be streaming it from somewhere.
Somebody has to be streaming it from somewhere.
Yeah, so like, say I have Amazon Prime, I can be watching a Prime video, and then on Discord you can just share your screen with people. So I don't know the legality of this, but...
Oh, okay. So you can't just like play a DVD or something and show it to people. That makes sense.
You could play a DVD if it's on your screen. It's on your computer. You can show people.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be like from a specific platform, because you can capture a window specifically, or you can just capture a whole monitor.
Okay, but you're not supposed to do that? Is that what you were saying?
I would say that I wouldn't stream a movie on my stream and then share it in Discord or something. Yeah, you want to be relatively careful. Like, they don't enforce people streaming movies on Discord. It happens all the time. Like in my long distance relationship with Trisha, we would watch a lot of stuff through Discord. So that's pretty normal. But
gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, watch parties.
Fair enough. Somebody in chat was asking about Guyana. That's a short one too. Guyana and Venezuela decided to talk it out. So that's the agreement they have, which is pretty much what I was expecting. So Nothing's going to come of that.
Mm-hmm.
I know the Venezuelan government said they were going to mobilize an army unit or whatever in response to a British warship that was sent to Guyana, but that was all just politics.
Mm-hmm.
It's just theater. They're not going to do anything. Nope. Neither Guyana or Venezuela is in a position to be fighting a big war right now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not going to come to anything. I'll try to talk next time about the Red Sea drama going on right now. I don't know if you've been following that at all.
No.
Oh, well, the shipping has been targeted by Houthi rebels in Yemen, and major shipping companies have had to divert their ships, container ships, around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa instead of using the Suez Canal because they're literally just getting attacked by Houthi missiles. So that's a problem, obviously.
Are the Houthis just shooting whoever or shooting specific people?
They say they're shooting only ships that are owned by Israelis in retaliation for the war against Gaza, but they're basically just attacking anybody.
Gotcha.
I don't even know how they would be able to tell which ships belong to who.
Mm-hmm.
So now the U.S. has sent a naval task force, and they said that they would start bombing them if they didn't stop, and now we are bombing them. That was something that happened this past week. So that has potential for escalation, but I'm also not too worried about it because I think there's a limit to how much both sides are interested in actually escalating. So
Mm-hmm.
that's probably not going to go too much further.
Mm-hmm.
But people are being really melodramatic about it in media, so that's been a big story. We'll talk more about that next time.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I'll try to talk more about just the general world because we haven't been on in a while, and there's a lot of stuff that's happened. So we might do like a little world tour.
Yeah, Chad was warning me the recent news was too spicy and that we were going to have a controversial segment, and then we just talked from the book about history the whole time. Hardly even got any.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's an easy topic to get me distracted with.
The thing that's so crazy about history too is like whenever you look at a specific region, a specific time, you immediately realize the expense of your ignorance about that, and it's like holy shit! Like a lot of people were very invested in some stuff during this time, and I know nothing about this based on my point of view. Cool. Let's learn.
Okay, so the final thing, and then I'll let you go. Have you ever heard of Helldivers?
Mm-mm.
No, okay, that's a
like
pretty
Doom
fun
guy.
game. Very different.
Okay.
It's an isomorphic co-op game.
Huh.
It's actually got a sequel coming out soon, which I hadn't even realized, and it's basically the same game but more of an FPS shooter. It actually looks really cool, but I don't think my computer can run it. But I was just curious if you've ever played Helldivers because that's kind of like a fun streaming type game.
Huh. It has really high ratings, 9 out of 10 on Steam.
Yeah, it's one of those little games that's not like super widely known, but among the people who play it, they love it. Like it's one of only 2 games that I've bought like cosmetic bullshit for, just because I wanted to support the developers. I think Path of Exile was the other one.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I've heard Path of Exile is really good.
Yeah.
This game costs like $3.
Yeah, it's pretty old, and I imagine the developers are more focused on the sequel at this point. So.
Oh, it's from 2015. Oh, cool.
Yeah, it still holds up pretty well if you can find, teammates.
Mm-hmm.
As the old saying goes, hell is other people.
Yeah.
So it goes with co-op games. But if you can find decent people, yeah, it's pretty fun. I was thinking about getting back into it. And I was talking to Moss about it the other day, and that got me thinking about it again.
Nice. It looks pretty cool. It reminds me a little bit of Diablo in terms of the combat style. Of it's top down and you're like shooting waves of enemies that are coming at you. But it's like all futuristic and sci-fi. It's not the Angels and Demons.
And the theme of the game is very much like early American War on Terror.
Uh-huh.
So you're fighting to quote unquote liberate alien species.
Right.
They play up the kitsch a lot in the game. It's pretty fun.
Mm-hmm. That's funny. Oh, nice. Cool recommendation. Stream the game with Aiden Smith. Yeah, we could do our first gaming stream. We haven't actually gamed together. Now that you play Balers Gate, we could technically duo in that.
Oh,
and then
that'd be fun.
Yeah, and then there's also this game, which you said. How many players do you get for it?
Maximum 4.
Maximum 4. Okay, so same as Balers Gate then.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, if you do want to do that, just know that I'm terrible at games.
Okay, so I wouldn't expect you to take turns like super fast.
Yeah, well, I mean, just not even just the time it takes, just bad decision making generally. But I can do it, just not particularly well.
Well, I got my 7th wipe in my honor runs today, so as of yet, my progress is still working on that good old Goblin City.
There you go. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, hit me up. I'm always up for a good time.
Cool.
And if somebody wants to play Helldivers, you've got my email.
Yeah. Looking for more Helldivers players. Solid game from 2015.
It holds up. It holds up pretty well. I made that email for commentary, feedback, and collaboration, but if somebody wants to use it to coordinate some gaming, feel free.
Nice. Well, chat, thank you for being pleasant. Fuzzy Cord, thank you for handling questions. We'll probably get to more of them next time. And Agent Smith, as always, it has been a pleasure. Take care of yourself. I will give you the 20-minute walk and 10 push-up challenge this week. Ooh, sneaks it in at the end just to say thanks we're over.
Sneaks it in at the end. Well, Thank you for having me, sir. Always a privilege. Fun to be back into it. Look forward to next time.
Hell yeah. We'll see you on the next episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
See you next time.
GG. Nice.